Have you ever pondered whether Adam's story had a different origin? What if Eve wasn't the first companion? What if her name was forgotten by history and only the night's whispers remembered? And what if her story was one of strength rather than weakness, one so powerful that it rocked the world? The silent wind of the night carries these questions like shadows. Like ancient witnesses, the stars above usher in secrets they have witnessed since the first dawn. We will gently delve into one of those secrets, the lost tale of Lilith. While you sleep tonight, it's quiet at night. The faintest whisper of something ancient, something sacred, is carried by a soft wind that stirs the leaves in the darkness. Though it is heavy, silence is not empty. It is waiting to be heard, full of memories. And in this quiet, Lilith's name echoes, faint but unwavering. This story starts with someone else, but most stories start with Eve, created alongside Adam, not after him. Equal in breadth and equal in shaping. She was created from the same soil, the same dust, and the same divine touch, not from his rib. However, Lilith's name was all but forgotten, whereas Adam's name endured. Almost for such whispers never really go away. What caused her to be forgotten? Did she not bow? Did she want to be next to Adam as an equal instead of below him? The world wanted to tell a different story, but her spirit was too free and unyielding. Her story thus faded into obscurity, into the recesses of ancient memory, and into the corners of old texts. Silence, however, does not imply absence. Lilith stays. Her name endures in the echoes of independence, the demands for equality, and the silent isolation of people who choose to remain invisible. We see a mirror of our own desires in her, the need to be heard, respected, and complete. Imagine her standing in the twilight of the garden as you close your eyes and allow the night to embrace you. Not as a shadow, but as a powerful, fearless presence. Imagine her asking the same question that so many of us still have. Why should one be less when both were made the same? She would be gazing at the same sky that you see tonight, a sky that is stretched wide with stars. This is a mirror, not merely an old legend. The same yearning is still whispered by innumerable voices in their cities, homes, and quietest moments. To be on an equal footing, to have freedom, to be recalled. So, as this story starts, allow it to come to you as a historical lullaby, a dream whispered into your heart, rather than as a lecture or lesson. The night has thrown open its arms, and Lilith moves forward in it. I want you to take a moment to think before we go any further. Take in the silence and the gentle cadence of your breathing. And I invite you to join this circle if this story has already sparked something inside of you. In order to hear the night's whispers repeatedly, subscribe to this channel. And tell us about yourself. Put your name and the city you are listening from in the comments section. Don't be lost in silence. Make your presence known. Consider the number of people listening right now from all over the world, people from different cities and on different nights who have come together to share this story. Additionally, there is a link in the description for those who want to delve deeper into obscure texts and lost books. All 88 books of the complete Bible, including the English translation of the Book of Enoch, are waiting for you there. Now pay close attention. Above, the stars remain silent. The wind breathes more slowly. Memory weighs down the night. Her story starts in this silence. The sky above the garden is so clear that even the smallest star can shine. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of perfect balance, where every sound has its place, permeates the air. Under the moon's watch, the rivers flow gently, their surfaces shimmering like silver ribbons. They carry a breath of eternity with them as they move across the land in a steady rhythm that is neither hurried nor still. The earth is alive with blossoms along their banks, the petals floating lightly as the breeze stoops to touch them. The scent of fresh rain, which seems to always linger in this timeless place, blends with the fragrance that lingers in the air sweet earthy and pure dot with their roots firmly planted in the soil where they were born. The garden's trees stand tall and patient as guardians. Their outstretched branches, laden with various fruits, provide shade and nourishment. One might think that the leaves are speaking as they gently sway with every wind whisper, whispering the language of creation and revealing long-kept secrets. The grasses beneath are cool to the touch, like carefully woven carpets, and act as cradles for each step. Animals coexist peacefully everywhere. The lion lies fearlessly close to the lamb, breathing steadily and half closing their eyes as if they too long for tranquility, singing quietly for the night but still resonating in the memory of the day. Birds nest inside the trees with their wings folded. The reflections of the deer tremble slightly on the water's surface before vanishing into silence as they bow their heads to drink near the river. Even the tiniest organisms, like the bees that hum softly close to flowers and the ants that march in lines, appear to be a part of a larger scheme, each at rest, each belonging. There is no sense of time in the garden. Neither morning nor evening rushes to get there or go. The light shifts gently and slowly, as if it doesn't want to disturb the sacred silence. The moon descends with silver grace after the sun's golden arms have warmed the garden. The garden breathes between them, peaceful and complete. The rivers sing the gentlest of hymns in this silence. They circle trees with strong trunks that are nourished by roots that delve deeply into their edges. Their waters are so clear that pebbles sparkle beneath them. They have been shaped by patience alone over countless years. The water has a reflection that feels more than a mirror when one kneels next to them. It feels alive, as if the river is aware of what is inside its current dot. The softness of balance permeates every step in Eden. The air is easy to breathe, neither thin nor heavy, and it fills the lungs with a sweetness that cannot be found elsewhere. Light and shadows blend together as though they were meant to be together. Shadows are soft, never harsh. There is only a steady, everlasting rhythm, no hurry, no demand. With every leaf, stone, and drop of dew perfectly positioned and complete, the garden is a place of being rather than striving. The silence grows more profound at night. A canvas of stars rises against the trees, which darken into silhouettes. The animals sleep deeper, huddled in secure spots, unfazed. Like a lullaby composed before time itself, the rivers never stop singing. The air is filled with a heart-warming sweetness as the soil cools. The grasses soften and the flower scent intensifies, and there's a feeling of alertness at the heart of it all, as if the garden itself were conscious, alive, and breathing with everyone who lives there. Instead of emptiness, the stillness is presence, a fullness so complete that it feels as though it is gently pressing against the skin. It's the kind of silence that pulls the heart into peace, where the soul can just relax and thoughts don't race. This is Eden before its peace was disturbed by division and conflict. before the shadows touched it. It is creation in its purest form, where harmony is lived rather than sought and nothing is broken. The trees produce fruit effortlessly. The rivers run smoothly. The animals act fearlessly. There is no whisper of discord, no burden of grief in the air. It is a world where all living things rest in the same embrace and every breath seems to fit into the same song. Therefore, the garden remains silent while it waits for footsteps to break the stillness, but for now, nothing is moving. The lamb stirs softly next to the lion as it breathes slowly. The deer sigh by the river, and the birds move in their nests. The leaves of the trees sway as though they are dreaming, and they observe with patient grace. Unbroken, the rivers carry the reflections of an unexplored world. Time itself appears happy to stop here, unwilling to disturb what is so peacefully at rest. The moon hovers as if it has nowhere else to go, and the stars stay fixed. It is an unending night and an unafraid peace. The garden waits in this silence, containing the entirety of what was intended. Stillness in this context does not equate to absence. It is existence of harmony, interwoven life, and pristine creation. This tranquility is so profound that it becomes ingrained in the heart, reducing the cacophony of everything that exists outside of it. And for a brief moment, even while it is being told, the listener joins in, breathing in the silence and relaxing in the tranquility of the garden while listening to the gentle hymn of Eden. When the time came, the earth was silent. The smell of rain and the weight of eternity in its grains were carried by the soft, rich soil. Forms started to emerge from that soil, molded by unseen hands. Dust collected, pressed together purposefully, each line and curve carefully sculpted. As the figure lay on the ground, still but with the outline of life, the silence grew deeper. The garden held its breath all around, as if it knew something bigger than itself was going to happen. The silence was then broken, not by chaos or noise, but by the gentlest of gifts, a breath. It took the shape of clay, invisible but more real than anything before. It filled lungs that were empty, roused a heart that had never pounded, and ignited light in eyes that had not yet opened. The dust had vanished. The shape had changed. The man, the first of his kind, took his first breath as life, warm and shaky, rushed into being. Asterisk. His chest rose slowly, hesitantly at first, as if the gift it held had shocked the body itself. The weight of starting made his eyes flicker open. Vision arrived gradually, as a silent unveiling rather than a flood. Shapes became clearer, the branches bending over him, the leaves quivering in the slightest breeze, the boundless sky above his reach. As though it had been waiting for him the entire time, his eyes wandered, wide and searching, taking in a world that was both familiar and strange. There was a wonder in the first breath that words could not express. He felt the cool earth that had given him shape as his fingers dug into the ground beneath him. Admiring the movement of his own body, he raised his hand in the air and spread his fingers as if to capture the light itself. He became aware of the sounds all around him, including the murmur of leaves, the distant call of a bird, and the soft ripple of the river. Every sound was like a secret being unveiled to him, a gentle reminder that he was no longer a part of the earth, but rather something that could walk on it. But beneath that wonder, there was a weight, a gentle ache that stirred. He was alone. Even though the garden was teeming with life and he could see every tree and creature, There was a void inside of him despite the harmony of everything that moved and breathed, the fullness of the air and the richness of the soil. Even though they were new, his eyes looked for another look. Even though his ears were full of bird and river sounds, he yearned for a voice that could respond. Despite their strength, his hands yearned for another hand to grasp. He moved slowly at first, exploring the garden with each step. As he went by, the flowers bowed softly and the grasses bowed beneath his feet. The deer stopped by the river's edge, the lamb stirred close by, and the lion raised its head to observe him. He had no fear of any of them, and none of them feared him. None of them were like him, though. Adam's heart murmured that this was not what he desired, even though the lion did not object when he reached out and placed a hand against its mane. He leaned to observe the birds flying overhead, their wings creating arcs against the sky, but despite their beauty, he couldn't see a reflection of himself. When he knelt to see, the rivers carried his image, but the water had no warmth or voice. To return, lonely and untouchable, his reflection blinked back at him, a silent echo that diminished with each ripple. When he pressed his hand into the ground, it responded with strength, but offered no company. Despite everything around him being magnificent, plentiful, and complete, he sensed a growing sense of inner emptiness and a desire that nothing could satisfy. Adam then lay on the grass with his eyes fixed on the sky and his breathing steady. As night approached, he listened to the quiet hum of the garden and the silence that spanned the stars. He felt a pain of longing, as if his heart knew what his mind was still unable to identify. He closed his eyes and gave himself up to the silence, not in despair, but in hope that the void inside of him would eventually be filled. Response arose from that silence. The same force that had breathed air into silent lungs and formed dust into life was now moving once more. This time it was something taken from Adam himself, not just soil. He fell into a deep sleep, one that was not one of fatigue, but one of mystery, in which his body froze and his breathing slowed. Something was taken from within his body, not lost, but shared, a part of him that was entrusted to grow into more. Then, she was born. Her gracefully rising form was shaped by life already in existence rather than just the earth. She breathed as he had, softly at first, then steadily, as if breathing had always been a part of her. She opened her eyes wide and inquisitively, seeing the same sky and trees, but with her own light. Her presence was tender yet strong, her hair falling like flame and shadow, and when she moved, it seemed as if the garden itself moved to accommodate her. The earth was cool beneath Adam as he stirred in his sleep. Upon opening his eyes once more, he saw what his heart had been longing for, but was unable to identify. She was not a beast or a reflection, but rather a person who shared his spark and breath. She had a voice of her own and was not silenced. She was a presence rather than a shadow, and her very existence provided him with an answer to his loneliness. The garden no longer seemed empty at that precise moment. As if all of creation stopped to observe the meeting of two souls, the trees appeared to bend closer together and the rivers to flow more gently. Since he was no longer breathing alone, Adam's breath came more easily and fully. Lilith, who was woven from his being but entirely herself, had arrived not as an echo but as an equal. Adam's first breath had been filled with wonder, awe, and loneliness. However, the hollow was filled with Lilith's breath, The garden, though unaltered, felt fresh again, alive in a way it had never been before, as their presence filled the silence. As the creation story progressed, the garden held its breath again. The earth stirred once more, full of promise and memory, where Adam had once been formed from the soil. One form of life was called upon to be given by the same dust that carried it. Something born in balance, woven with the same attention to detail, sculpted with the same purpose, rather than an afterthought or a shadow. Form emerged once more from the silent soil, where the roots whispered their secrets to the rivers. This time, the light was carried by breath, hair, and fingers. It was a tender moment, as if creation itself had paused to observe. The cool, steady ground gave her being its essence. Her body was gracefully sculpted, delicate yet strong, shaped as an equal rather than an echo. Her breath, like a whisper of wind through leaves, entered the silence as her chest finally rose. It had a unique rhythm that was steady, gentle, and lively. A world awaited her when her eyes opened, and within them glistened a mysterious depth that was both familiar and completely unfamiliar. Lilith stood as someone who had been meant to be there from the start, not as a new addition to the garden. Like memory, the soil adhered to her skin, reminding her that, like Adam, she had also risen from the earth's dust. The trees appeared to bend in greeting, and the rivers mirrored her image. All the animals awoke in silent recognition, because creation itself recognized that her birth was equally sacred. The garden did not view her as secondary. She was not less than Adam, but her presence was different. She exuded a silent strength, as if the breath inside her had been waiting for its moment to come out. She walked lightly on the grass, her bare feet grazing the roots and petals, and the ground seemed to react tenderly wherever she went. As if sensing her touch, it slid around her effortlessly when she raised her hand. In the air, she fit in because she had the same beginning, the same breath, and the same mystery, not because she was an outsider. When Adam first saw her, he was amazed. Once restless with loneliness, his heart felt a strange calm. She appeared before him as someone who reflected his origin while maintaining her own identity, rather than as a shadow or reflection. He saw in her the life that throbbed as strongly in her as in him, the breath that bound them both, the earth that had shaped them both. She was a mystery at heart, but she was also like him and different from him. Something in her eyes simultaneously unnerved and reassured him. Adam experienced a recognition that went beyond words when their eyes locked. Even though he had no idea what he was waiting for, it seemed like he had been waiting for her all along. She was a voice that responded with her own, not a silence, to saturate his loneliness. She was a soul standing next to him, whole and complete, not a hollow space filled with things. The garden itself appeared to change in recognition of their encounter. The fragrance of the blossoms was carried between them by the gentle movement of the wind. As if roused by invisible hands, the river rippled. The animals raised their heads and gazed silently. Two creatures made of the same dust and breathing, the same breath, were now standing next to each other in a moment that was precariously balanced. Lilith's initial movements were clear. She walked confidently, as if she had always been a part of the ground. She carried a sense of familiarity and mystery, as if creation had woven her from threads Adam was already familiar with, but could never fully identify. Her posture exuded a serene strength, and she gazed at Adam with recognition rather than awe or submission. She belonged to him but was not his property. Despite coming from the same dust, she was completely unique. They silently investigated one another's lives. In the quiet moments that ensued, Adam observed how her hair fluttered in the wind and how light and shadow were reflected in her eyes. Lilith examined the rhythm of fresh life in his breath and the way his hands touched the ground. Instead of a fragment of themselves, each saw, in the other, a counterpart, two threads woven from the same fabric, side by side rather than above or below. Their origins held the key to the mystery of equality. Since both had been summoned from the same source, their creation did not separate them. This fact, which was already known but could not yet be expressed, hovered in the atmosphere like a gentle secret. They were both formed by the earth, and each was equally infused with the breath of life. It wasn't more or less. Nevertheless, a silent consciousness awoke within Lilith's heart. She could feel it in the way her body carried its own strength and the way the soil supported her weight. She was designed to walk alongside, not to follow. She was created to be equal, not inferior. In the unbroken harmony of creation, in the rustle of leaves, in the flow of rivers, the garden whispered it. She was different from Adam, but that didn't make her any less. Complete, whole, and alive, she was her own being. Lilith accepted Adam's hand when he extended it, acknowledging rather than giving up. Their fingers made contact, and their internal breaths appeared to harmonize during that encounter. Two lives that were born of the same dust were brought together by the simple fact that they had a common origin rather than by ownership. This initial connection, the balance of two souls standing side by side, was witnessed in the garden. Their creation was characterized by the silent mystery of equality rather than hierarchy. Adam and Lilith, both born from the earth, both carried, by breath, both alive beneath the same limitless sky, were all that existed in the silence of Eden, before strife, before division. The harmony before the storm, the balance before the breaking, the moment lingered, gentle and timeless, as though the garden itself wanted to hold it forever. There was only presence for the moment. Lilith and Adam both breathed, and the air carried them. The soil that had formed them had given itself equally, so it had no preference. Its value was not divided by the dust that had been shaped into flesh. They were just two lives at first, side by side, connected by a common ancestor and bearing the same existence's mystery. Their footsteps were light on the soft grass that extended endlessly beneath the trees of Eden as they walked side by side. The air felt soft and warm, as though it were gently holding their breaths. As they moved in silent unison, sunlight splattered across their shoulders and poured through the leaves like golden rivers. Above them, birds floated languidly, their wings rustling the still air with melodies that rose and fell like soft waves. As the rivers flowed, whispering to themselves, they carried the scent of blossoms resting on their surface and the reflection of the sky. They felt as though everything in Eden held them in a steady, peaceful, and complete rhythm. When words felt too full to contain, Adam's voice, soft with wonder, frequently broke the silence. He would stop to admire the way a tree's branches curved, the sweet scent of a fruit, or the glimmer of light on running water. Lilith listened with a smile that was both amused and patient. Her own eyes strayed farther, taking in the texture of bark beneath her fingertips, the way shadows moved in patterns that only Adam could see, and the secret songs of insects humming beneath petals. So she did not see the world solely through Adam's eyes. She frequently expressed these insights, her words creating a rich tapestry of information that broadened Adam's perspective and eased his loneliness. Sometimes they didn't say anything at all, and silence took on a language of its own. As their eyes drank in the wonder that surrounded them, they would stroll along the riverbanks, the edges of their hands caressing each other mindlessly. They became familiar with one another's rhythms in this state of silence, the way Lilith cocked her head when she saw something invisible, or the way Adam would pause just before speaking. Their quiet, unhurried laughter came from the sheer delight of being alive with one another rather than from jokes. The garden was filled with the sound of laughter, which shattered the silence with a sense of community that together they would welcome the rising sun in the mornings and observe the delicate rose and gold hues of the light as it swept across the garden. Lilith would sit with her knees bent, staring at the changing hues with thoughtful eyes, while Adam would extend his arms toward the sky, seemingly welcoming the gift of another day. They were reminded that they had the same breath, the same dust, and the same gift of life when the sun's warmth touched their skin. They had the impression that nothing could separate them during those times, that the garden had been created specifically for their company. They would reach for fruit together when hunger arose, picking pomegranates, grapes, or figs, and sharing the sweetness with unspoken thanks. With simple yet affectionate gestures, Adam would frequently give Lilith the first taste. Lilith would return the favor with a quiet smile and offer him what she had discovered. It was an act of mutual joy rather than obligation. Two souls were happy to feed each other, just as the garden fed them both. Together, they probed the depths of Eden and found hidden locations that creation had concealed in plain view. Adam followed Lilith to shady groves where streams carved tiny pools that reflected the sky and the air smelled of honey and blossoms. Adam then took her to the tops of hills that dominated the whole garden, where the horizon was infinite and the air tasted of distance and wind, as if Eden were more fully revealed when viewed through two pairs of eyes rather than one. Their friendship grew stronger with each new discovery. They would lie side by side on the cool grass at night when the stars came out. Adam frequently gestured up, using his finger to trace constellations as if the sky were a map just waiting to be deciphered. Lilith would listen while lying with her eyes focused on the sky, though her mind was frequently elsewhere. She saw the stars as more than just far-off lights. They were voices of mystery, calling inaudibly with questions too big to put into words. The silence between them was comforting, as if their very breaths had learned to beat in time with each other, and they lay together beneath those innumerable points of light. Their harmony also appeared to have an effect on the animals of Eden. Nearby, a lion would move slowly and unthreateningly, its golden eyes serene. As if interested in hearing their laughter, birds flitted near, perched on branches just above them. In the distance, deer moved lightly, stopping to look back as though they recognized something in their company. Because Adam and Lilith possessed the same composure and gentleness that Eden exuded, the creatures of the garden were not afraid of them. Their friendship was characterized by their simple presence rather than elaborate displays. Lilith would kneel next to Adam as he worked the soil, his hands firmly pressing against the ground, her fingers silently caressing the roots. Adam would watch in wonder as Lilith wove flowers into colorful chains, his heart full of admiration, rather than jealousy. By walking side by side, each contributing their unique light to the harmony they shared, they discovered the silent art of companionship, which is not about dominance or submission. Nevertheless, a feeling of mystery persisted. Despite their unity, Adam sensed it when he saw a depth he could not quite comprehend in Lilith's eyes. Lilith felt it as she stood next to him, feeling both a part of him and apart from him, united but completely her own. However, the mystery did not cause conflict in these early days. Rather, it was a gift, a reminder that harmony could exist, even when each soul carried its own hidden secrets, and that friendship did not supplant individuality. Time itself seemed to lose meaning as the days went by in such peace. Without any sense of urgency, morning gave way to evening, and night descended upon them like a gentle veil. With its rivers, trees, and winds, the garden continued to bear witness to their union. In the tapestry of Eden, which was woven with tranquility, laughter, and silent recognition, each breath they exchanged was an additional thread that Adam experienced a sense of belonging he had never experienced before, replacing the loneliness that had previously shadowed his steps. Being noticed and strolling through the garden as one half of a friendship formed from the same dust rather than as a lone soul brought Lilith joy. And for Eden itself, there was harmony in their harmony, as if walking together under the boundless sky made the world breathe easier. There were days when Eden appeared to be unaltered, with the air still smelling of peace, the blossoms still opening to the sun's warmth, and the rivers still flowing in their never-ending rhythm. However, beneath the calm, a subtle tension developed between Lilith and Adam. Once always moving in unison, their steps occasionally became erratic. Their once harmonious silences now sported a hint of unasked questions. The garden itself stayed calm, but tiny shadows started to move through their hearts, suggesting that difference could blossom even in paradise. Adam frequently got up early in order to get to work with the soil, his hands digging deep into the ground as he shaped, arranged, and named. He felt obligated to define and guide as though the world required his direction to be complete. He was proud to address the animals by their names, feeling as though he had been granted the power to influence creation with words. Lilith's heart was both admiring and uneasy as she watched him with quiet eyes. She wondered if naming and ordering were not also within her rights, as she could feel the whisper of earth in her bones and the pulse of life in her veins. She was stirred not by defiance but by a desire to be equally part of life's rhythm. She would kneel by the river, her fingers grazing the water's surface, and reflect on how the water flowed freely, unrestricted by a single command, but instead directed by the harmony of stone, earth, and sky. She recognized herself in the river, free, alive, and in need of room to go in her own way. However, Adam would occasionally give her a small smile, as if he found her fantasies amusing, or remind her that he was supposed to take the lead when she attempted to express these ideas. Once natural, their conversations started to change as a result of these minor variations. When the stars were like lanterns in the sky at dusk, Lilith would whisper about mysteries, about the earth's secret song that only patience could hear, and about the stars as silent voices calling to them. Adam listened, but he started thinking about structure and goals. He talked about naming, shaping, and guiding, and he anticipated that she would walk with him in support of his perceived role. His remarks were not harsh, but they implied that he was the leader and that she was to follow. However, Lilith's heart was not so easily swayed. She was aware that the same divine breath had created her from the same dust. She saw a companion in Adam rather than a master or a guide. Furthermore, she did not perceive any softer strength or diminished value in herself. Instead, she experienced the fullness of creation within herself, as though her veins were glowing with the same fire that gave him life. However, she frequently kept these thoughts to herself and carried them in silence because she felt that expressing them too strongly might upset the delicate equilibrium they still shared. Their differences became more apparent in small moments. Adam once picked the ripest pomegranate from their fruit collection and gave it to her, anticipating her appreciation. Lilith grinned and agreed, but she couldn't help but wonder why he thought he should make the decision. Adam once put his arm gently across her shoulders to lead her through the grove. It was a gentle gesture, but Lilith questioned why she needed to be led when her feet were equally adept at finding their way. Adam's expectations were based on conviction rather than cruelty. He felt that he had already been assigned his role, which was to guide, mold, and lead. Despite his love for Lilith, he saw her as the person who would be by his side, supporting him, fostering harmony, and cooperating with his wishes. Lilith, on the other hand, yearned for something more: equality, a partner, and the understanding that her presence, her decisions, and her ideas were not less important than others. She would lie awake next to him at night when the stars were all over the sky, and she would listen to the silence between their breaths. She pondered why being with someone must require giving up one's own voice, considering the wind's freedom and the river's independence. Unaware of her silent distress, Adam dreamed happily, thinking their harmony was unbroken, oblivious to the tiny cracks that were beginning to appear in the stillness of her heart. Despite their lack of speech, the garden's animals appeared to notice the difference. At one point, a bird sat between them, chirping as if to alert them to their balance, but Adam reached out and took it first. Lilith grinned at the tiny creature, but there was a hint of contemplation in her smile. Why should one assume possession when both were standing under the same sky? The first hints of tension started to emerge in these instances, in these murmurs of difference. A question started to reverberate between Adam and Lilith. Even though the garden was still serene, the rivers were still singing, and the trees were still swinging in unison. If one was expected to lead and the other to follow, could two souls from the same dust really walk together? Lilith didn't ask out loud yet. Rather, it weighed lightly but steadily on her heart. Adam carried on as usual, happy in his part, oblivious to the way her silence developed into contemplation. Even though their footsteps continued to be side by side, and their laughter continued to reverberate throughout the garden, something new had entered the silent start of change. It was a whisper, a shadow, a reminder that even in the silence of Eden, the seeds of change were starting to sprout. It wasn't harsh. It wasn't yet a storm dot within that sacred silence. A silent conversation was about to take place that would change the beat of paradise. The garden lay in its eternal calm, the air scented with blossoms and the gentle hum of hidden life. For many days, Lilith's heart had been silently carrying her thoughts while she searched for the strength to give her voice shape, her gaze resting on the rivers and the boundless sky. She had walked in unison with Adam, shared in his labor, and laughed at his happiness, but the whispers within her grew louder, like uncontrollable winds. One night, as the sun began to slowly set and the first stars began to rise, she turned to Adam with a firmness and love in her gentleness. She spoke steadily and with the serenity of conviction. Her words were not sharp. With a voice as steady as water on stone, she whispered, "We are of the same dust. I get my life from the same breath that fills your chest. So why don't we walk side by side as equals?" She looked into his eyes, not in defiance but with longing, as though she wanted him to see the truth she held deep inside of her. Adam listened, but her words weighed heavily on the order he thought had been established. He had never considered questioning the roles he had assumed, so his brow furrowed in confusion rather than anger. He answered calmly, but with a hint of finality, "You are my companion. Yes, you are at my side, but I was the one who formed it in the first place and was tasked with leading it." His voice did not rise, but it contained a quiet certainty that made her heart ache. "You are to walk with me, but the path is mine to choose." As though the garden itself were leaning in to listen to their conversation, the night wind blew softly across their faces while carrying the subtle rustle of leaves. Lilith's heart constricted, but she remained unflinching. She muttered, "If you were first, it was just for a second. I was shaped by the same earth that shaped you. The same breath that roused your chest also roused mine. We share the same essence, even though you may call yourself first. Adam, I'm not beneath you. I stand next to you." Adam looked away from her toward the rivers that shimmered in the last of the light. He was silent for a long time, the kind of silence that stretches across the ground like a shadow. At last he spoke, his tone softer but no less firm. "I have been given responsibility for the garden. I was tasked with taking care of the soil and naming the animals. It's just the way things are. You're here to enjoy it with me, but I bear the responsibility." That was the established order. For a moment, Lilith closed her eyes and listened to her own heartbeat as well as his words. As if it were etched into her very being, she sensed the truth inside of her, unflinching. She opened her eyes once more, and her voice carried a deepened strength, despite its calmness. "You talk about burden, but you fail to notice that I am also burdened by the garden. Just as the soil stirs within you, it stirs within me when I touch it. I recognize the creatures when I gaze upon them. This is not something you bear alone. I was created to walk with you, sharing your breath, earth, and call, not to trail you." A mixture of tenderness and uneasiness was visible in Adam's eyes as they met hers. He admired her presence, the elegant way she strolled through the garden, and the musical quality of her laughter. The idea that her voice might have the same authority as his, however, troubled him. Instead of anger, he felt a silent resistance, as if he held on to a truth he did not fully comprehend. Above them, stars grew in number like unending sparks of light as the night grew darker. The silence stretched again between them, but it was no longer one of harmony. It was a tense silence, as quiet as the wind, but as solid as stone. Lilith's spirit blazed with the certainty of equality, while Adam's thoughts revolved around his belief in order. Neither of them raised their voices because their dispute was one of quiet, steady, and uncompromising whispers rather than shouting. Lilith touched the ground, her fingers digging into the ground, and then she spoke again, her voice a whisper. that held the weight of all time. Adam, we were created from the same soil. And what separates us if breath is breath and dust is dust? Since creation itself exhibits no such measure, why must I degrade myself? None of the rivers are higher than the others. They all flow. Each tree is assigned a specific spot beneath. The skies, they grow alongside one another. The stars themselves emit the same amount of light. So tell me, why don't we follow suit? As if looking for answers beyond what she had said, Adam looked up at the stars. The animals were sleeping, the garden was quiet, and the air was hushed with respect. His mouth opened, but he remained silent for a while. When he finally spoke, there was a quiet strain in his measured tone. Perhaps we shouldn't question the order. It might have to stay the way it has been given. It's the same if one takes the lead and another follows. To oppose that would be to oppose the hand that molded us. Lilith could feel his words pressing down on her like a shadow, but she remained unflinching. Her voice was a whisper of strength and tenderness as she leaned closer. I submit to the hand that formed us. I live as I was created in order to honor it, and I was designed to stand rather than bow, to be whole, not less. Let us walk together as one if we are genuinely companions, not one above and one below, but side by side, each of us carrying the same vitality. The faint sound of running water was carried by the night air as it gently stirred between them. Silently, Adam's heart struggled between his certainty about his position and the love he felt for her. Lilith's words lingered like the unavoidable steady beat of a drum, her eyes shining softly in the starlight, her composure unwavering. With the animals sleeping in their peaceful spots and the rivers muttering in the darkness, the garden appeared to hold its breath, as though all of creation stopped to listen. Even though they stopped talking, the impact of what they had said persisted. Once a place of harmony, the garden now echoed with difference, but this difference was one of conviction rather than rage. It was the murmur of equality, expressed in cool, firm truth rather than fury. A deeper tension that would not go away with the night was beginning. The warmth of Eden's days had diminished. Even though the rivers continued to flow unhindered, the trees continued to bear fruit, and the animals continued to roam naively. Something invisible had changed between Adam and Lilith. Although their steps no longer fell in perfect rhythm, they continued to walk through the garden together. Their once easy, laughing voices had become hushed. Silence, which stretched between them like an impenetrable veil, had replaced harmony, which had once been like the morning song. Every look, every silence between words carried the unsaid. Lilith would stand close by, her eyes straying to the horizon, her thoughts ensnared in ideas she was unable to express without reopening the wound of their argument, while Adam would kneel to tend the soil. Even though she didn't say it out loud, he could feel her distance, and he carried the burden of their previous conversation inside of him. He clung to the idea that order had been given to him alone, but he wanted the solace of her closeness. The air was as soft as ever, but the nights in Eden felt colder. They would sit next to each other, but spiritually separate under the star canopy. Adam's eyes remained focused on the ground in front of them, but Lilith's frequently looked up, searching the heavens. Their quiet was heavy, the kind that carried the pain of unspoken words and unresolved longing, but it was not hostile. The stars themselves appeared to observe the rift that had started to take root in silence. That there was love and sorrow in Lilith's heart. She still treasured Adam's company, their laughter together, and the easy pleasure of strolling alongside the trees and rivers. However, beneath her tenderness now lay a silent pain, as if she lived in a place that no longer fully accepted her. Voice. She questioned whether he could really see her as an equal soul made of the same dust and given life by the same divine breath. She was afraid of the wall of resistance that had previously greeted her words, so she was hesitant to speak again. Adam did not identify the distance, but he felt it too. He noticed the way her laughter no longer came as easily, the way her footsteps sometimes strayed from his path. He missed the ease of their early years, when happiness came naturally and friendship flowed like rivers. However, he felt obligated to a role that he could not give up because he thought it was etched into his soul. To him, giving in to her assertion of equality would be tantamount to doubting the very order of creation. Therefore, despite his love for her, he stayed steadfast and preferred silence to making amends. Once a haven of harmony, the garden started to reveal their internal conflict. Although the beauty persisted, Lilith observed that there was a subdued sadness in the night's stillness. Even their innocence served as a reminder of what had been lost, even though the animals appeared to be unaffected by their peaceful rest. The ache inside her would grow as she watched the deer bend to drink from the river together, unconcerned by authority or order. Adam occasionally made an effort to close the gap by using straightforward language, considerate gestures, or fruit offerings. The warmth between them never fully returned, but Lilith would accept politely. Even though their hearts were still drawn to each other, something prevented them from doing so. Although love persisted, it was overshadowed by difference, and difference is a silent burden that persists long after the last word has been spoken. Lilith occasionally strolled by the rivers by herself, her hands grazing the water's surface as she reflected on the freedom it offered. The river did not bend itself to follow someone else's path or request permission to flow. It carried life with it wherever it went because it was designed to move. She saw a reflection of herself in the river, a spirit that yearned for acceptance rather than disobedience, for equality rather than power. Adam would stay among the trees during those same hours, naming the animals and caring for the ground. However, he would still look off into the distance, where Lilith roamed while he worked. His pride, or maybe his fear of divine order, prevented him from reaching out, even though he felt her absence like a missing breath, though he secretly knew that silence was gradually dividing them. He convinced himself that it was safer than confrontation. The rift became most noticeable as night fell and they lay under the stars. The stars appeared colder now, but the heavens above them continued to sparkle, their beauty unaltered. Where Lilith and Adam had once marveled at their light together, their gazes now turned upward on their own, each seeking solace that the other no longer offered. The two souls below were bound by silence, and the stars remained silent, watching without responding. Lilith started having different dreams. In her dreams, she saw wide open spaces where she could move freely, her spirit unrestrained, her steps unimpeded. In her dream, she was standing on the brink of creation, shouting in a voice that was respected and heard. These dreams haunted her during the day, reminding her of the things she wanted but lacked. Unease also affected Adam's dreams. In his dream, he saw the garden deserted, the rivers running without her beside him. and the loneliness still bothering him while he slept. But when he woke up, he clung to the hope that their disagreement would end, and that time would soften her heart enough to embrace the role he felt was rightfully hers. If she just gave up, he told himself, there would be peace again. However, he was silent and failed to notice that she was getting farther away every day. The rift crept across the landscape like dusk, silent and neither violent nor loud. It softened the edges of joy with the haze of sorrow, but it did not break the garden. They still walked together, still shared the same air, yet their souls moved further apart with every unspoken word, every withheld touch, every night spent beneath the cold gaze of the stars. Even though the rivers continued to sing their soft melodies and the animals continued to sleep in innocence, Eden had changed. Soft, subtle, sorrowful distance had crept into the center of paradise. It was the kind of distance that grows subtly, like a shadow growing longer as the sun sets, without making an announcement. Adam and Lilith both felt its weighty, unavoidable presence, even though they didn't discuss it. The night she left started out just like any other. Under the silver wash of moonlight, the garden continued to glow, and the gentle winds blew through the trees as if Eden were alive. But something had already changed irrevocably in Lilith's heart. Love still existed, but it was now burdened by the never-ending shadow of inequality, and the silence that had developed between her and Adam felt intolerable. She was aware that she couldn't stay. The garden had turned into a place where her voice was no longer free. Even though Eden's air was sweet, its rivers were pure, and its stars were endless in their light. Remaining would mean betraying the truth that roused her soul restlessly. She got up from her spot by the river, where she had frequently gone for solitary walks to reflect. As if the heavens themselves were trying to direct her steps, the moonlight spanned the water and created a bright path in front of her. Every step she took on the soft grass felt both light and heavy light with the release of an unspoken decision, heavy with sorrow. Sensing movement but not fear, the animals roused in their slumber. There seemed to be a silent silence even in the night air, as if creation itself knew what was happening. She walked with memories in her heart. She recalled Adam's first look at her, their shared laughter among the flowers, and the way the rivers sang as they passed one another. Even though she still treasured those times, her spirit was no longer bound by them. Eden was not a prison in appearance, but it had become one in spirit. Love without freedom was like a cage. The idea of staying silent and not being seen as an equal weighed on her like an unseen burden. She was aware that the garden could no longer support her wings and that her soul was destined to soar. As she went on, the wind shifted more forcefully, bringing with it the aromas of the land's sweet flowers, ripe fruit, the Christmas of running water. It seemed like a parting gift, the final embrace of the paradise she had cherished. With their leaves rustling like voices saying goodbye, the trees whispered to her. The moon, high above, glowed brighter, painting her path in pale silver. She raised her gaze in its direction, and for the first time, she perceived it as a companion observing her departure rather than a far-off light. Adam was sleeping beneath the branches of a large tree not far away. Unaware that the sound of her footsteps was already displacing him, he continued to wander the garden in his dreams. Maybe he would have woken up and called out to her. Maybe he would have gotten up and grabbed her hand. However, he had been oblivious to the increasing distance because of his pride and his confidence in his position, and it was now too late. He was not awakened by Lilith. Her heart ached at the thought of leaving him unaware, yet she knew that if she stayed, her spirit would wither. It was preferable to love him from a distance than to be invisible by his side. She stopped for one last time as she crossed the edge of the garden. The stars above gleamed with eternal calm, the trees towered in their quiet majesty, and the rivers glistened in the moonlight. Eden's unfathomable beauty was insufficient. I was made from the same dust, with the same breath, and I cannot forget that truth, she whispered softly, as if addressing the garden itself. Her words faded into the night air, but they remained steadily certain in her heart. She walked into the unknown and out of the garden's boundaries. Her spirit felt oddly at peace, even though the ground became less soft and the air grew colder. The night sky spread wide above her, endless and vast, and the winds rubbed against her hair as if pushing her onward. She experienced for the first time the vastness of the world outside Eden, a world that had not yet been given a name or tamed. Although it was uncertain, the prospect of freedom drew her in. Adam woke up from his slumber behind her. His dreams felt cold, empty where she had been. In his sleep, he extended his hand and found nothing but empty air. The stars were still, hanging over him when he finally woke up, but the room next to him was chilly. He got up fast, looking around the paths, calling her name into the still night. However, his words were met with silence, and the echoes of his own loneliness came back to haunt him like a shadow. He was struck with the realization that she was no longer there. Without her, the garden felt different. The rivers continued to flow and the trees continued to bloom, but the beauty was no longer complete. Her absence was now felt in every nook and cranny of Eden, as if her spirit had been woven into the very fabric of the place. Adam wandered through the night, his heart heavy with sorrow and confusion. He had not thought she would leave, not believed she would dare to step beyond the garden's boundaries. Eden had seemed ideal to him, but she had decided to leave. Lilith, on the other hand, pushed into the darkness. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't turn around. Love still bound her to what she had known, so leaving was painful, but the call for freedom was greater. Each step into the unknown was a step into her truth, into the life she was meant to claim for herself. The winds murmured softly about her as if the very elements recognized her bravery, and the moon continued to hover over her, directing her course. On the night she left, there was wind, moonlight, and silence instead of fire or thunder. It was the quiet of a decision, gentle but firm rather than the sound of battle. The first significant separation in human history occurred in the silence of that night. It was a departure driven by necessity rather than hatred. Freedom had demanded the voice of love, but love had not died. With the strength of the same breath that had given her life, Lilith left Eden and entered an unknown future. Adam stood at the edge of the garden behind her, staring into space with a heavy heart. The winds did not convey any information about her whereabouts, and the stars did not respond to his sorrow. For the first time, he experienced the vastness of loneliness, and Eden, which had once been a place of laughter and company, grew dreary and empty. Lilith, however, saw the night as a beginning rather than an end. Though her heart was heavy with grief, Her spirit was full of hope for the vast and unknown world that lay beyond Eden. Her steps were lifted by the winds, and she was accompanied by the moon's silvery light. The garden was gone, but she was not. She found the strength to continue walking into the unknown in that truth. Before her, the sea was vast and silver in the moonlight, and it went on forever. As the waves swept up to meet her and then retreated, whispering secrets as they did so, Lilith stood at the edge of the shore where sand and water met, her bare feet sinking into the moist ground. The rivers of Eden were not like the ocean. As though being led by a tender hand, the rivers had meandered through the garden with clarity and order. However, the sea was untamed, wild, and boundless. Its breathing was rhythmical, rising and falling in time with the earth's slow heartbeat. For the first time since leaving Eden, Lilith did not feel confined, and she could feel its vastness pressing against her spirit. She saw possibility in the distance of what seemed to be an endless horizon. She was alone, though, and the freedom came with a hollow ache. There had once been a shared silence in Eden as they walked side by side with Adam, punctuated by words and laughter when necessary. The only sounds in this place were the sighing of the winds, the crash of the waves, and the faint sob that came from her own mouth, touched by the salty air. Her hair cascaded around her shoulders as she lowered herself onto the cool sand. Even though she was crying a lot, her eyes shone in the moonlight. She had chosen this path, she reminded herself, yet even choice could not erase the sorrow of what was lost. She had had companionship, which had been consoling despite being tainted by expectations. She sat small against the vastness of the night, which now pressed wide and infinite against her chest. Her feelings seemed to be reflected in the waves, which occasionally crashed in violently and at other times caressed the beach. Their beat turned into a lullaby of release and sorrow. Lilith shed her tears freely, and they blended with the sea's salt and vanished into its boundless body. Because the sadness was genuine and necessary, she did not fight it. Beneath the sadness, however, was a faint sense of relief. She was free of the bonds of silence and obedience, and even though she was alone, she was herself. She pressed her hands into the sand and felt the cold grain slide between her fingers. She was astounded by how the earth felt different here, raw, unformed, and unsoftened by the divine hand of Eden. Like her own soul, this was the earth in its most untamed state. Leaning back, she allowed her hair to fall across her face as the wind blew over her. In contrast to the sweetness of the garden's blossoms, it had a sharp, purifying scent reminiscent of salt and far-off storms, as if the sea itself were etching its presence into her very being. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, allowing it to fill her lungs until it stung. The stars overhead were innumerable, dispersed throughout the sky like innumerable witnesses to her isolation. She pondered whether Adam looked at them that night as well, whether the same constellations descended upon his solitude. She pondered whether pride still kept him from grieving completely, or whether he thought of her with rage or sadness. She did not ignore the thought, even though it lingered in her mind like a ghost. She allowed it to lie next to her grief, a silent companion to her loneliness. She was lulled by the sound of the waves, which rose and fell like eternity's breath. The sea didn't question her decision or pass judgment on her. It reminded her that there was something greater than Eden and even greater than her own sorrow, and it accepted her tears and kept her silent. The earth felt cool against her back as she lay on the sand and gazed up at the sky. She felt oddly comforted by the overwhelming vastness. Eden was not the end of the world. There were still mysteries to be discovered. As the night grew darker, Lilith's tears became softer. Her grief started to give way to silence, a serene acceptance of her current situation. She recalled what she had said before she left. We are of the same dust. Here, with the sea. Near the shore and the stars close at hand, she was even more struck by that realization. She was a part of the earth beneath her, a part of the breath of the ocean, and a part of the wind that encircled her. She was not abandoned, but she was alone in form. Her companions were the elements themselves, who spoke to her in hushed tones. In their eternal tongue, she got up again and strolled along the beach. Every step created a brief impression that the approaching tide soon erased. It made her realize how flimsy human existence was in comparison to the vastness of creation, and how even friendship and love could wane like footprints in sand. However, the idea humbled her rather than alarmed her. She understood that her story was just getting started, that it was being written in the vast unknown world outside of a garden rather than in the safety of a garden. The waves subsided and the wind became softer as the night went on. As if holding her sorrow and lulling her to sleep, the sea appeared to find a more gentle rhythm. She took a seat once more and embraced herself, not out of fear, but out of comfort. She could still feel the sharp, unavoidable loneliness, but she could also feel a slight stirring of strength inside of her. The path was difficult, but it was hers because she had chosen freedom. The promise of dawn flickered faintly across the horizon, a pale glow that suggested the sun was just waiting to rise. Silently, Lilith kept her gaze fixed on the boundary between the sea and the sky. She pondered the stories she would now be a part of, the paths that lay ahead, and the new day that lay ahead. Only the sea's never-ending rhythm could respond, and she allowed its melody to carry her thoughts into the still morning as the night gradually gave way to light. She rested her head on her knees and took deep breaths. Even though her heart still hurt, it beat with a fresh clarity, as though the sea had cleansed her soul. Even though she was alone, it no longer felt empty. Rather, it felt necessary, like the silence before a fresh start. The sea had turned into her mirror, reflecting her strength and her grief, her vulnerability and her independence. Lilith realized as she sat on those desolate shores that she had entered a vast, unexplored world where she would be able to express herself freely and be reminded of her chosen freedom by the sound of the waves. Lilith felt the world around her breathe with a freshness she had never experienced before as the first rays of dawn stretched across the horizon, brushing the sea with delicate gold. The waves rolled steadily as if to lead her on, and no longer seemed to cry with her grief. She got up from the beach, the sand strands sticking to her feet, and for a while she just stood there, feeling the weight of her isolation change into something else. It was still heavy, but it was a cloak she had chosen, not a chain. The wind caressed her skin as though welcoming her into this unformed life, and the air smelled of morning and salt. She opened her arms wide, closed her eyes, and allowed the wind to blow across her face and through her hair. It muttered against her in a language of freedom rather than one of resistance or command. She became aware that she was no longer judged by the expectations of others and was no longer walking in their shadow. She took all of her own breaths and took all of her own steps forward. She experienced the immensity of options for the first time. Eden had been lovely, but it was bounded, contained, and characterized by Adam's presence and the Creator's will. She could see no boundaries or walls here, only the unknown lands ahead and the expanse of sea behind her. The idea was exciting and intimidating at the same time. Although she was unsure of her future course, she found strength in that uncertainty. She no longer felt constrained by the world. Instead, it unfolded before her like an infinite scroll, beckoning her to write her own tale. Her thoughts reverted to the words she had uttered in defiance, "We are of the same dust." Those words, which had been born in a moment of silent rebellion, now throbbed inside her like a heartbeat. The earth's dust belonged to her as well as to Adam and the Creator. She belonged to the wind and sea, the earth and the sky, and her worth was equal to his. The ground felt firm under her fingers as she pressed her hand against it. She spoke to it in a whisper, not as a servant, but as a sister, and she pictured it responding to her with steady strength in the quiet. The sky was painted in gentle rose and amber hues as the morning gradually came to life. As they soared, birds called to each other as their wings gracefully sliced through the air as they rose from the shore. As they vanished into the distance, Lilith watched in awe, her heart pounding. She briefly envied their wings before realizing that she possessed a unique form of flight that no feather could match, one of spirit and freedom. No one could stop her from walking where she wanted to, speaking how she wanted to, and loving how she wanted to. The realization caused a silent fire to slowly spread through her veins and fill her chest. The wind surged past her ears like a chorus, stronger than before. As if the air itself were carrying messages for her alone, she closed her eyes and listened. Its voice was strong, wild, shifting, and playful rather than harsh like Adam's or commanding like the quiet of the garden. It told her she was not small. It told her she was not bound. She stood with her arms wide, her hair whipping around her, her eyes shut against the rising sun, and she smiled for the first time since her departure. Freedom did not erase her loneliness, but it gave it meaning. Her solitude became space, and in that space she began to feel her true self unfolding. She walked slowly from the shore into the grassy lands beyond, her steps unhurried, her senses alive to every sound and scent. The earth here was unshaped, not carefully ordered like Eden. Rocks jutted out where they pleased, grasses bent whichever way the wind commanded, and wildflowers bloomed without pattern. There was no hand arranging them into beauty, yet they were beautiful still, perhaps even more so. As she moved, she began to hum softly, her voice blending with the rustle of grasses and the call of unseen creatures in the distance. It was not a song she had known before. It was born from her lips in that very moment, shaped by the air she breathed and the freedom she felt. Each note rose and fell like the waves she had left behind, carrying her emotions outward into the world. For the first time, her voice did not feel contained. It echoed softly, carried by the wind, until it seemed to belong to the very sky. Her thoughts no longer dwelled only on what she had left, but began to wonder about what she might find. Is there anyone else out there? Would she encounter other beings in this vast world, or was she really alone? She was not alarmed by the idea. She welcomed the idea of facing life as an equal, face to face, free from chains and submission, but she did not seek to be completed by another. Despite the scars, her heart remained open, and she could feel its strength increasing with each step. She stopped close to a group of stones, the morning sun warming their surfaces. For a moment, she allowed the silence to return as she sat on them, her face raised to the sky. However, this was not the stifling, icy quiet of Eden following her arguments with Adam. This quiet was alive with the distant roll of the tide, the faint hum of insects, and the cries of birds. Then she understood that, despite her perception of being alone, she had never really been. The world itself was with her, every part a silent reminder that life was vast and rich. Even though her heart still hurt, she found it harder to cry. Rather, the light of the day reflected in her clear eyes. The words lingered in the air, gently carried away by the wind, as if the world itself wished to remember them. I am free, she whispered to herself, her voice soft but certain. The phrase gained weight when spoken out loud. It was now a reality, rooted in her body and breath, rather than just a thought dot. As the day wore on, Lilith stood up once more, the serene strength coursing through her, revitalizing her body. Every step she took felt like a promise. She would never again put herself in chains or lower her spirit for the sake of others. With the sun's warmth on her shoulders, she ventured farther into the unknown, her shadow extending far across the ground. She didn't have any belongings, a map, or a plan, but she did have one thing, the knowledge that she was her own. She laughed softly, the sound blending with their voice as the winds rose again, swirling around her in soft gusts. She allowed herself to imagine that they were dancing and playing with her, reminding her that freedom was a shared journey with the boundless breath of creation rather than a solitary one. Her spirit resounded with strength, her freedom no longer a frail whisper, but a song etched into the very air as her heart lifted and she ventured out into her unknown world. Whispers of Lilith floated into the air like smoke rising from concealed embers beneath the vast expanse of the night sky as the ages started to unfold, and human voices began passing down their stories from one generation to the next. Her memory started to live in the whispers of those who had never seen her but sensed her presence in the shadows, no longer limited to the desolate beaches she had once traversed. Her name would be whispered, half in wonder, half in fear, around campfires, where the fires cast shadows on the faces of those who heard them. Those who refused to bow referred to her as the woman of freedom. Others described her as a shadow that moved at night's edge, listening, watching, and never completely disappearing. From one storyteller to the next, the question that started it all was, what happened to the first woman to walk alongside Adam? Because her absence could not be permanently concealed by the story of Eden. There had been another presence in that garden, but it seemed to have disappeared into the unknown. Thus, the image of Lilith expanded as the silence gave way to curiosity. She was characterized by some as a wilderness nomad, with eyes blazing with wild wisdom and hair flowing around her like the night sky. By claiming that she haunted the hours when the moon was high, her voice carried in the rustle of trees, and her laughter echoing faintly when the winds grew restless. Others molded her into something more terrifying because it contained both Longing in fear, her story went viral. She was seen by some as a warning, a rebellious person who had rejected the first man and even the Creator's command, choosing exile over obedience. Others held her in high regard as the embodiment of what it meant to take one's own life, even if it meant going into exile. Women in particular would listen with a peculiar pain in their hearts, caught between the quiet bravery of this woman who had lived free from chains and the silence they were supposed to maintain. Mothers would warn their children not to wander at night in the quiet of the villages, implying that Lilith might be nearby and that she might take them if they ventured too far from the fire. On the other hand, elderly women seated in the corner of those events would occasionally lean in and whisper a gentler truth. Lilith was not just a taker, but also a guardian, a spirit that kept an eye on those who went unnoticed and gave courage to the voiceless. She became less of a real woman and more of a contradictory figure of legend as the myths changed and evolved, reshaped by the tongues that told them. Some claimed that Lilith's voice was rising in rage and her spirit was stirring the night as storms rolled across the desert and winds howled through the rocks. Some mothers, thinking she was close by, whispered her name in terror when a child cried in the dark, and no consolation could calm them. Nevertheless, women would occasionally close their eyes and silently call to her when they were alone and burdened, not as a demon, but as a sister who had already experienced the loneliness. Her myth was unavoidable because of this duality, respect and fear. Her footsteps seemed to be carried by the desert itself. Strange encounters under the moon were reported by travelers who also mentioned seeing a woman's figure hovering just out of their field of vision and disappearing when they got close. According to some, wolves circled close to her as if she were their kin, owls perched on her shoulders, and she walked with wild animals. Others said she entered men's dreams and spoke words they couldn't recall when they woke up, leaving only the feeling of her proximity. Each storyteller reshaped her, but no one was able to stop her. Her name turned into a whisper that was whispered from lip to lip, spoken carefully, as if it were said too loudly it might call her. But it persisted, even in secret. Her name carried the weight of defiance, and names have power. To give her a name was to recognize that not all tales ended in submission, that some people chose to forge their own route despite the high price. Even though it was veiled in fear, there was a secret seed of wonder in that whisper. One voice secretly pondered what it might mean to live as she had untethered, unbroken, unbound for every voice that cursed her. The story of Lilith moved farther from history into legend as the generations went by. She evolved into something larger, a symbol woven into the very fabric of night, rather than just the woman of Eden. In order for a woman to walk the winds and move undetected in the Fezan dark, the people gave her wings in their minds. They endowed her with the ability to control shadows, dreams, and the uncharted territories where mystery and terror reside. Her essence, however, stayed the same at the core of all these stories. She was the one who refused to kneel and left. With wide eyes, children would ask, who was she, really? And with their eyes reflecting the firelight, the storytellers would smile subtly. Never with certainty, they would respond in riddles. Some people claimed that she was the first woman. Others said she was a spirit of the wilderness. A few whispered, their voices barely audible above the crackle of flame, she is the night itself. Lilith lived more in her imagination than in her memory as a result of the truth fading into myth and myth fading into mystery. Her story became more and more of a mirror as it spread. She embodied what each listener longed for or feared. She appeared to the terrified as a monster hiding in the shadows. She was a ray of hope for the downtrodden. In the quiet of the night, she was a friend to the lonely. She was also seen by those who aspired to power outside of their world as someone who had touched it, who had left paradise with nothing but herself and persevered on as time passed. Her name continued to reverberate like an unabated echo. She evolved into a timeless presence, a shadow and a light that existed wherever stories were told. Rather than just a recollection of Eden, the earth itself seemed to remember her steps, the winds to carry her voice, and the stars above to hold her secret. They all agreed that Lilith had never been erased, even though nobody knew for sure what had happened to her. She had changed. She had become immortal in the only way that mattered in story, by stepping over the thin boundary between flesh and legend. Each star pierced the darkness with a subtle shimmer, like watchful eyes that had witnessed innumerable ages pass. As the night grew deeper, like a velvet curtain gradually drawn across the sky, the quiet wasn't lifeless. It was alive with the distant owl's call, the stirring of wings, and the gentle rustle of invisible motions. The whispers of Lilith became heavier in this enveloping silence, as if the night itself had become her garment. She had evolved into the very essence of night, a presence that lived in its shadows and was neither completely understood nor completely feared. She was no longer only remembered as a woman who left Eden when the moon rose too brightly, when the trees draped long fingers across their windows, and when the midnight silence seemed to loom too close. Children awoke with uneasiness. In order to keep Lilith at bay, mothers would lean over their children and whisper prayers in hushed tones. These prayers were passed down from one generation to the next, because they thought she wandered the night, looking, listening, and observing, her footsteps soft and unending. They whispered that she arrived when everything became quiet, when the earth held its breath, and even the winds paused to dot. She was pictured as a figure moving between shadows in the quiet of the villages, her eyes glinting like two dark stars, her hair flowing behind her like rivers of blackness. People claimed that the owls, whose eerie cries reverberated through the night, were her companions and messengers, carrying her voice through the quiet. For many, the sound of wings fluttering against the sky served as a constant reminder that Lilith was close. According to some, she sat on rooftops and watched through the slender window openings, her invisible presence chilling the bones of those who slept. However, the night carried her as its soul in addition to making her fear it. The idea of her woven into the silence, a presence that gave the night its depth, its mystery, and its shape was oddly comforting, because the darkness might have seemed empty without her. It throbbed with life alongside her, containing untold tales and an age-old cadence that resounded through the heavens. Some people believed that Mother's fear was just one aspect of the situation. For others, she was the protector of quiet, the specter who transformed the night into a world of secrets rather than just a lack of light. Shepherds standing guard in moonlit fields would hear the owls' cries and pull their cloaks tighter around their shoulders. Uncertain if it was a warning or a prayer, they muttered Lilith's name under their breath. They said they had seen her in the distance, moving along the hillsides, her silhouette merging with the sky as if she were carved out of the night itself. In their tales, they described a figure that resembled a living shadow rather than a ghost, one that belonged to the vast, unending night rather than any man or house. With each repetition, she became more and more associated with shadows. She was described as the shadow that gathered in room corners and as the shape that hovered just outside of vision, vanishing when people looked. They claimed that when candles flickered and a sudden chill went through the air without any wind, they could feel her touch. Her myth became inextricably linked to the night world, since Lilith had turned into its heart and its unseen pulse. Discussing the midnight hours was equivalent to discussing Lilith. Daughters were taught to recite old verses and blessings against Lilith's presence by their fearful and protective mothers. In order to deter her from approaching, they tied red thread charms close to the cradles of infants. Children grew up, never understanding the distinction between the song's end and the spell's beginning, because the prayers were whispered rather than loud, almost incorporated into the lullabies themselves. Lilith's shadow persisted in the anxieties of all mothers, influencing the protective customs that persisted long after the original tale had been forgotten. However, there was an odd reverence in her name even in these charms and prayers. It was said with weight rather than in a dismissive manner, as if acknowledging her authority was part of the statement itself. The night was never really empty, and to defend against Lilith was to acknowledge that one believed in her. Her presence was thus maintained by caution and fear. She became more and more ingrained in their thoughts, anxieties, and rituals the more they prayed against her. Every whispered charm was a crown on her invisible head, and the night was her kingdom. Her spirit was a threat and a companion to those who walked alone under the moon. She was described by wanderers as being close by, not as a monster, but as a presence that pervaded the wilderness. Her voice, which was both gentle and eerie, carrying neither malice nor consolation, but rather something deeper and older, was occasionally heard by the lonely in the rustling leaves. And during those times, they were unsure of whether to pray or to listen, whether to run or to remain motionless. Her dual nature, beautiful and unnerving, became reflected in the night itself. The cool air carried her breath, the owl's call was her song, and the shadows stretched across the ground like her arms. Others took comfort in the idea that someone, somewhere, walked with them during their restless hours, while others shrank away from her. She was a haunting to the terrified. She was a friend to the broken. She was evidence to the forgotten that loneliness could persist. Thus, Lilith as the night spirit evolved from a mere tale into an explanation of the secrets of the very dark. She was responsible for the infant's inexplicable late-night cries, the abrupt silence that descended upon a room, and the vivid and peculiar dreams that occurred during a full moon. She was more than just the woman who had left Eden on foot. She was the soul that inhabited every nighttime sigh and shadow. She had evolved into a figure that gave the night its voice, presence, and soul, the embodiment of both what people secretly needed and what they feared in the dark. But beneath that trembling, there was something more, a pull, an unspoken fascination that made people listen longer, linger on her story, and whisper her name again when they thought no one was listening. There were nights when her presence was discussed in whispered fear, when the mere mention of her name sent shivers through crowded rooms. She was the mystery that caused adults to stop at the window and gaze at the moon, wondering if she really drifted through the night winds, searching, calling, or watching, but she was also the shadow that scared children into silence. Every time she told her story, fear and allure intertwined until they were inseparable, like threads in a dark tapestry. According to some tales, she crept into houses and slipped through doorways, appearing icy yet oddly comforting, as if the night itself had crept in to perch on the bed's edge. Mothers held their babies tighter, afraid of her breath on their sleeping babies, but some people acknowledged, almost in private, that the thought of her coming to visit evoked both fear and an unspoken curiosity. What would it mean to actually see her, to know that the ghost that haunted the dark could come out and be real? What about her captured the heart's attention despite its trembling? She was seen by some as a demon, the personification of danger and disobedience. They related stories about her infiltrating dreams and whispering temptations that made people restless and unable to find tranquility. She was characterized as a beautiful but defiant figure with hair that flowed like rivers of darkness and a voice that was like a song that was both sharp and tender, a melody that stuck in your head long after the dream was over. She represented everything that posed a threat to the world's order, including the night that disobeyed the sun and the shadow that knew no bounds. However, those who were afraid of her acknowledged in the same sentence that they were unable to completely turn away, because there was something magnetic about her rebellion. She stood for a freedom that others could only dream of in private. It was both terrifying and amazing to leave Eden, to choose independence over submission, to embrace the vastness of the unknown instead of the security of paradise. Her dual nature was carried by the stories like a flame, with wonder and caution intertwined. In addition to being the dark figure that mothers feared for their kids, she was also a whispered symbol of strength among the lonely, the outcasts, and the restless souls who thought that maybe the night had something to offer them as well. The world was unable to reconcile her paradox. She was portrayed differently in each retelling. She was the gift of courage to one and the thief of peace to another. Some claimed to have seen her silhouette by riverbanks, her image glimmering in the moonlight on the water's ripples, inspiring fear and desire. Some claimed to have felt her hand briefly touch theirs in the middle of the night, leaving there, hearts racing with a mix of fear and longing, a feeling that she was equal parts comfort and danger. She survived stories because of this contradiction. Prayers alone could have sent her into silence if she were merely a demon. She might have been worshipped carelessly if she had only represented freedom. However, she was both, and she was alive because of the conflict between fascination and fear. She slipped between roles, existing in the liminal space between light and shadow, never fully claimed by either, and the more people attempted to name her, the more elusive she became. This complexity was even evident in the prayers that were uttered against her. They were soft, trembling whispers rather than angry shouts, as if those who prayed against her also secretly respected her authority. The threads were woven with the knowledge that her spirit lingered, unavoidable, a presence too great to ignore. But mothers tied charms to keep her away. Men warned their sons about her dangers, but there was an unspoken awe in their words, the kind that results from combining admiration and fear. Stories of her appearing at a crossroads, where the path of night and day seemed to meet, were shared by travelers seated by the fire. She could be seen, they said, in the flicker of flames, her figure swaying like smoke, her voice vacillating between invitation and warning. Some said she revealed secrets, whispers of the unknown that both frightened and educated. Others claimed she made them sleepless for nights afterward, haunted by the memory of her presence rather than nightmares, and they couldn't decide if they feared she would return or wished she would. Her duality permeated life's very cadence. She was the mystery that made the night enchantment, the chill that swept through a room, the shadow in the lullaby, and the silence between the owl's cry and the wind's response. She personified the aspects of life that people were afraid to confront in the open, such as the pain of loneliness, the desire for independence, the fear of forgetting, and the bravery to leave. All of these contradictions existed within her, and it was precisely this complexity that gave her legendary status. She turned into a mirror for those who talked about her as the tale spread. She was a demon to those who were afraid. She was a symbol to the courageous. She was a friend to the lonely. She was a guide into the unknown for the restless. Because she had never opted to be limited to a single role, she was never just one thing. She was a part of the night, and the night itself was both beautiful and frightening, threatening and reassuring. She therefore persisted in memory because people could not stop talking about her, not because they all agreed on who she was. A myth cannot be maintained by admiration or fear alone. However, the story breathes forever when both are entwined. The hushed prayers, the shaky lullabies, the restless dreams, and the snatched looks at the moon were all places where Lilith lived. No matter how terrified, the world could not turn away from her because she was the night itself, dark, eerie, and lovely. As her name spread farther, carried on whispers that became chants, and chants that were woven into rituals. The nights grew heavier. Families started using songs and symbols, old rhythms created out of fear and tradition, to defend themselves in the quiet of their homes where oil lamps flickered in shadows hung long against the walls. Mothers seated beside their cradles tied red thread cords above their babies' heads in the hopes that the uncomplicated knot would deter her invisible approach. Fathers etched signs into the wood of doorways, lines of protection that glowed dimly in the mind with every muttered prayer. The markings were etched not only into the wood, but also into memory. These behaviors weren't merely customs. They were the beating heart of faith and fear combined to create something that made the people feel secure in their weakness. Women's voices carried like gentle incantations through the night as the lullabies rose softly from their lips. These songs were not meant to soothe the children alone, but to push back the silence, to fill the air with sound so that the presence of Lilith, the night wanderer, would have no room to slip inside. Every note was an appeal for safety, and every verse served as a reminder that love is inextricably linked to protection. The melodies were circular and repetitive, like waves crashing endlessly against the shore, as if the night itself required a song to ward it off. Fear was mellowed into ritual, and ritual into tradition in the rhythm of these lullabies. In addition to the songs, the items, amulets, and charms made out of faith and desperation also contributed to the darkness's protective power. Above beds were small tablets bearing words of power, their surfaces engraved with names designed to ward off the presence of wandering spirits. The rudimentary yet powerful shapes of clay figures were buried close to thresholds, guardians standing silently at the edge of houses. Some people painted symbol circles inside circles on walls because they thought Lilith couldn't go beyond what had no end and would wander aimlessly at the edge, unable to break through the timeless pattern. Because of their fear, the people developed a language of protection, a means of communicating with the invisible through song and objects, and a means of reminding themselves that they were not defenseless against the dark, even though they were. Trying to push her away, there was a strange reverence beneath the surface of these rituals, a recognition of her power. Because singing against her meant naming her, and naming her meant preserving her memory. She maintained her position in the night the more they defended themselves. She was a spirit that was feared but honored by the very act of resisting her. She was both an enemy and a muse. She was never forgotten thanks to the prayers that were muttered at the edges of beds, which carried her name like a thread through time. From the moment they breathed their first breath, children learned from the lullabies that the night was never really empty, that it was full of wonder and danger. As the amulets were handed down from father to son and mother to daughter, they came to represent continuity and united families across generations. With the faith of innumerable hands, the frayed fibers of a red cord from one cradle were strengthened and tied again for another child. Above doors hung a clay tablet that had been cracked with age, its inscription barely visible but alive with meaning. These artifacts conveyed tales of bravery and fearlessness, of individuals who confronted the night's immensity and responded with modest yet impactful actions. Every charm and chant contained both strength and fragility, the strength of believing that words, songs, and symbols could protect life, and the fragility of realizing that life was vulnerable. In villages, the songs were occasionally incorporated into group rites. Under the moonlight, women gathered together, their voices rising into the sky like smoke as they blended into a single steady chant. They created a communal barrier of sound and faith by singing not only for their own children, but also for everyone else who slept close by. As though time itself curved around their voices, the rhythm was hypnotic and slow. During those times, unity became its own kind of strength, and fear was changed into unity. In addition to providing protection, the songs united people by uniting their hearts in the common struggle against the darkness. Additionally, travelers brought their own safeguards. They sang to themselves, low and steady, repeating lines designed to keep the night spirit at bay. On long roads where the desert stretched out and the stars seemed to go on forever. Simple charms made of wood, bone, or bronze hung from their packs. They were heavy with faith. In addition to providing warmth, fires were constructed for their light, which, like the songs, deterred her. Men and women whispered prayers into the smoke as the flames crackled, sending them upward like invisible shields. Every ritual, no matter how minor, served as a reminder that surviving required not only physical strength, but also spiritual strength. That ability to transform the invisible into something that could be fought. Even young children learned the words to these lullabies before they could walk, too young to fully comprehend the intensity of the fear. They played with the sound of the name that their parents cautiously whispered, repeating the chants as games. For them, the prayers were strange, gentle melodies that brought them comfort before they had any deeper significance. Nevertheless, in this naivete, the customs were preserved, perpetuated by voices that sang despite not yet understanding their purpose. In later years, when fear confronted them, the songs remained in memory, waiting to blossom into understanding. The rhythm of life itself was shaped by the rituals, which became so embedded, sleeping was never just rest. It was a surrender to the night that demanded song and symbolism, a transition into a vulnerable state that needed protection. The night was never merely gloom. It was a realm inhabited by the invisible and protected by ceremony. The songs of protection stood at the center of this delicate yet resilient balance between the physical and the spiritual, the visible and the invisible, which became life. As a result, the people used their hands and voices to shape the night while living in fear. The lullabies flowed through the air like invisible shields. The charms hung above them like silent guardians, and Lilith's presence was both remembered and resisted in every prayer that was whispered against her. She lived within the very safeguards intended to expel her, so even though she was kept at bay, she was never truly gone. Every silence was accompanied by rhythm, every shadow was accompanied by a melody, and the night had transformed into a space where songs and spirits danced together. Where fear and resiliency met, the whispers of a woman whose presence lingered in the night were carried by firesides and drifted across deserts in the earliest layers of human memory, before writing carved its permanence into clay. Her shape changed with stories, and her name changed with tongues. But at her core, she was a dusk creature who was both feared and revered. She initially appeared as a shadow at the edge of mythology in the Mesopotamian world, where the rivers Tigris and Euphrates created cities and ziggurats rose like steps toward the heavens. According to clay tablets, Lilith were roving night spirits that followed the winds, infiltrated dreams, and brought fever and instability. One of them became more recognizable and eerie than the others until she was finally identified as Lilith. In order to ensure that she would not disappear with the shifting sands of time, scribes preserved her story in clay, making her more than just a whisper but a shape in the darkness. She was not a wife or a friend in those Mesopotamian echoes, but rather a spirit that haunted the edges of existence and was connected to the unknown. She was named in rituals that attempted to control the uncontrollable and invoked in incantations intended to expel her. Her image appeared in amulets carved with inscriptions pleading for protection from her grasp, not out of honor, but rather as a warning. She served as a reminder to the cultures of the Fertile Crescent, which were steeped in the gods of the sky, storm, and sun, that not all powers were good or orderly, and that some existed in the crevices of creation itself. She was the glimmer of fear in a mother's heart, the breath of the midnight desert wind, and the presence at the threshold that no guardian could completely ignore. As Thales spread from Sumer and Akkad to other places via traders, conquests, and the gradual blending of cultures, Lilith's character started to change, taking on the colors of every new place. She had sharper edges in the Babylonian imagination, and her role as a night demon that preyed on mothers and infants was more clearly defined. Her presence was also associated with death and illness. She was required to act as a counterbalance to the Babylonians' conception of order, as their gods used inflexible scales to measure justice and chaos. They dressed her in terror, but beneath the terror was fascination, because she served as a reminder of things that neither God nor the Godmender law could completely control. Her name spiraled inward like a trap in the incantation bowls hidden beneath thresholds, her power recognized even in the act of resistance. As they traveled and settled, the Hebrews took her whispers with them and incorporated them into their own conceptions of creation and exile. From a nameless spirit to a symbol of rebellion and longing, Lilith became intertwined with the story of Eden in their writings. She was no longer merely a wandering demon. Instead, she was recast as Adam's first companion, created from the same dust rather than his rib, equal in origin but divided in spirit. She gained both flesh and myth from this retelling, which combined fresh creation stories with ancient Mesopotamian shadows. She once lingered on the brink of illness and death, but now she defied the rules and strode into the garden, abandoning not just Adam but also the peace of paradise. Her memory sharpened in the silence of absence, and her rebellion was transformed into a story that clarified why she prowled the night and lingered on the brink of human fears. Even more, her name crept into the Mediterranean world, where ancient Semitic tales blended with Greek imaginations. She was compared by some to Lamia, a ravenous ghost that preyed on both lovers and children, cursed repeatedly but never vanished. Others compared her to Impausa, a shape-shifting entity that haunted men at night, or to the sirens that sang from rocky shores. Instead of creating her from scratch, each culture shaped her like clay that never hardened, stretching her form to suit their fears. She was both a mother and a monster, a spirit and a symbol, a presence in both the real world and dreams. With every recounting, she shifted from being a single entity to more of a mirror, reflecting the fears of those who called her name and carrying the uncontrollable, timeless image of the night inside of her. Lilith never truly belonged to one people or one story. Instead, her presence lingered like smoke across languages and geographical areas for centuries. Her name was uttered in tremors, in Aramaic incantations, her power imprisoned within protective circles. She moved from tent to tent, invisible but palpable, and was described by desert nomads as the restless wind itself. Her story was woven into visions of angels, demons, and the harmony of creation. In Jewish mysticism, she became the embodiment of rebellion, the shadowed Eve's opposite, both needed and hated. She danced with Samiel, the dark angel, according to some mystics, and their union was a symbol of forbidden's power, a truth that was never completely denied but was too risky to speak out loud. Lilith's murmurs were both frightening and fascinating. To mention her was to recognize a conflict in life itself, the division between chaos and order, freedom and submission, light and darkness. She was the embodiment of what was uncontainable and defied both human and divine authority. She was dangerous because of this, but she was also memorable. Every curse, amulet, and lullaby made sure her memory would not fade. So myths that attempted to erase her only served to preserve her more thoroughly. She lived because she was feared, not because she was loved, and fear has a way of perpetuating names. The old whispers of Lilith serve as a reminder that myth is a river that flows through time and space, carrying fragments that accumulate, disintegrate, and reassemble. She was not just one form but innumerable, not just one story. She was known as the restless Litu in Mesopotamian nights, a demon repelled by charms and Babylonian prayers, the first companion in exile in Hebrew imagination, a night wanderer, a devourer, a seductress, and a spirit that straddled the line between the human and divine in Greek and later traditions. Her presence became less about the specifics of who she was and more about the truth of what she stood for, as the whispers that started on clay tablets made their way into scrolls, songs, and stories. She was a figure who eluded every culture, but left her mark on them all. She was danger and freedom, fear and desire, Her story was never fully told, even in those old whispers. She only became more enigmatic and resilient with each recounting, adding another layer of complexity to her existence. Refusing to completely fade, she waited at the edges of light, observing from the folds of time, hovering where myth and memory met. The moon hung heavy, full and glowing on the night, which spread its pale blessing over the world like a silver veil. Lilith discovered her reflection in this gentle radiance, a presence that was a blending of light and shadow rather than entirely either. She wandered, her form moving silently on the night air currents as the world below the sky fell into its sleepy rhythms. The moon did not frighten her. Rather, it embraced her, illuminating her with light that did not harm or condemn, but instead brought out her true self. Her fate was linked to the rhythms of the cosmos rather than the soil of Eden, and in its radiance, she appeared less like an exile and more like an eternal companion of the heavens. People felt her presence within the full moon's pale circle, as if she were sewn into its very glow when they looked up and shuddered at its pull. Likeness, not chance, was the reason behind her connection to the moon. The moon itself was a timeless mirror that defied categorization. It was both constant and ever-changing. It was a thing of phases that alternated between fullness and shadow, whole yet concealed, luminous yet frigid. Lilith was the same, both. Visible and invisible, feared but secretly desired, vanishing in one form and resurfacing in another. She rose in stories to pull at the tides of people's imaginations, just as the moon rose every night to pull the tides. To those who looked for patterns in the night, they were inseparable as they danced together across the earth and the heavens, each reflecting the other. Her spirit appeared to reside in the long, thin shadows that stretched when the world was illuminated by the silvery radiance of the full moon. Trees twisted their shapes on the ground, and she was visible in the shadow between the branches, a figure not quite formed but felt, hovering on the edge of light and dark. Owls flew across the sky on wide, silent wings, their cries resonating like far-off spells, and she followed them, her footsteps as silent as their flight. Instead of betraying her, the shadows welcomed her as kin, and under the moon's watch, they came to life and danced against the night's stillness. Youngsters who ventured to gaze upon the luminous fields murmured that the shadows had faces, that they moved too freely to be merely illusions, and they always spoke her name uneasily. The moon served as both her veil and her lantern. As clouds passed over it, reducing its brightness, she was enveloped in privacy, able to move about unobserved. But she was revealed, clad in silver, her figure glowing against the darkness as the sky cleared and the full moon shone brightly. The truth of her existence was then inscribed all over the country, and there was no way to hide it. Her image was etched into their memories as something both beautiful and terrible, as if they had caught a glimpse of a secret not intended for mortal eyes. Those who witnessed her in such moments did not forget. Some people had trouble sleeping because of the vision. For others, it remained a mystery too seductive to be banished, a secret sweetness. It was no surprise that rituals and prayers were linked to the moon's phases. Her absence was feared when it was new and concealed because she seemed to be strengthened by darkness without light. People became uneasy as it waxed and swelled toward fullness, feeling her proximity every night. Because the full moon was believed to be her time, mothers whispered lullabies more softly, husbands stayed by their wives' sides more intently, Charms were hung by windows, and amulets were pressed against doors when it reached its roundest. Glow, however, despite their efforts to protect themselves from her, they were unable to turn away from the light above and were compelled to go outside and raise their gazes, seemingly attracted to the very threat they were afraid of. Lilith saw companionship, not fear, in her solitude. Only the moon, which reflected kinship rather than judgment, could relate to her. The moon was expelled from the sun, deprived of its brightness, and left to shine with borrowed light, much like she was expelled from the garden. However, there was a mystery more potent than direct fire in that borrowed light. Aside from the sun's harsh rule, the moon's soft, gentle glow ruled the hours of rest. Similarly, Lilith ruled in the gentle domination of night rather than the dazzling fields of day. She found the echo of her own life in the moon's phases, which were waning, waxing, retreating, returning, never going away, and always circling. It was claimed that the oceans responded to the moon's pull, which carried her essence, and that the tides themselves rose and fell in time with her breath. She swam among the waves, her body gleaming with scattered light, her hair as dark as the waters, according to whispers from fishermen who cast their nets by moonlight. According to some, she sang, attracting men to the beaches where the sea and the sand met as her voice blended with the roar of the tides. Some resisted, stifling her call with muttering prayers. As the sea engulfed their footprints, others voluntarily followed, going barefoot into the surf, and later reporting that they had felt the weight of her gaze or the brush of her hand. The sea, the moon, and Lilith became intertwined, each influencing the imagination of those who were enchanted by them. Whether in reality or in fantasy, the image of a woman under the moon was the greatest source of longing for poets in the past. They described a silver-clad figure in their verses, with a half-shadowed face, starlit eyes, and a presence that was more spirit than flesh. The poets referred to her as eternal, an embodiment of the very night sky, while others referred to her as dangerous. Her tale was whispered in temples and sung in taverns, in warnings and love songs. They claimed that she was the keeper of the moonlight, which was both a boon and a temptation. Her presence lingered as softly as breath, and those who lay awake in the full moon's glow, gazing at the patterns of light through their windows, felt her gaze upon them. The human need to explain what roused them at night gave rise to the bond between Lilith and the moon, which was not merely a product of poetry or fear. It was simpler to think that someone walked with the moon, directing its power and embodying its mystery, when the moon was full and its light was too bright for sleep, when shadows came to life, and when dreams grew bright and strange. Lilith's name became associated with the lunar glow because to name that presence was to give shape to uneasiness. She was the reason hearts raced when the silver light spilled across the earth, the face in the moon's shadow, and the whisper in its brightness, and that connection persisted as centuries passed and tales evolved. Her connection to the moon persisted even after her name was changed in various languages, and her image wavered between goddess and demon. When the full moon rose, heavy and glowing, the people felt Eden's presence, even though they may have forgotten specifics about her and argued over her place among angels or spirits. She was the eternal exile who found her throne in the heavens themselves, not in gardens or temples, the shadow that danced with its light. She was never fully defined and always hovered on the brink of perception, taking on her most authentic, form in that dark space between mystery and clarity. Some saw her as a manifestation of fear, a ghost that crept into homes at night to seize the most valuable possessions, a reminder that safety was never guaranteed and life was brittle. Others saw her as a vision of freedom that was forbidden, a promise of passion freed from fear or rule, and an echo of freedom that cried out against the inflexible walls of order. Rather than negating each other, these two faces blended together to create a paradox that neither worship nor condemnation could adequately capture. Lilith's power lay in the fact that she was both the whisper of longing and the Ken's embodiment of dread. Unlike a demon who inspired only flight or a god who inspired devotion, her presence pressed itself into the human heart. Instead, she remained like a mirror. Whether that truth was hunger for what had been forbidden or fear of the unknown, it was evident when one looked upon her. She was terror to the farmer who fretted over his infants in the cradle, the cause of the amulets, and whispered charms that kept him awake at night. She was freedom to the dreamer, restless under the stars, the woman who had rejected obedience and found a place on her own in solitude. She was shaped differently by each story and whisper, but she was always whole and unbroken by contradiction. Her duality was most apparent in the quiet of midnight, when shadows drew long and the air seemed heavy with invisible breath. Fearing that she would move with the wind outside, a family might lock their doors and shout prayers into the air. A poet would enter the moonlit fields at the same time, his face lifted to the sky as if calling her forth, longing to catch a glimpse of the supposed wandering figure. The same night was filled with both desire and fear, with open palms reaching toward the darkness and trembling hands gripping charms. She was the queen of both. She belonged to secret songs as well as warnings, to yearning as well as nightmares. Her ambiguity had a hypnotic quality. Her dominance came from her inability to be pinned down. People who cursed her name were unable to stop saying it, and people who gave her secret praise frequently shuddered as they did. Her identity turned into a mystery written in shadow, a tale told in whispers that drew listeners in rather than alienated them. She might have been exiled by fear alone, but fascination bonded her to the human spirit. She turned into the blades edge, the moon reflecting dark water, the sigh that was both invitational and warning. Village elders were extremely cautious when discussing her. She was characterized as a figure that wore darkness like a cloak, slipped through walls, and preyed on men's frailty or children's innocence. The younger ones, however, listened with wide eyes and were unable to look away from the images that were evoked despite their shudders, because there was allure even in the warnings. For a moment, danger and beauty were indistinguishable, and to imagine her was to venture beyond the boundaries of the familiar. She frequently appeared in their dreams as a woman who was luminous with mystery, with eyes as deep as oceans and hands that were both delicate and dangerous rather than as a monster. Desire and fear blended together until they were indistinguishable. She resembled the moon she frequently accompanied. The same beauty that attracted lovers to linger beneath it also caused anxiety in those who feared the night, and the same silver light that led travelers also made shadows strange. The moon was a force beyond human control. It was neither entirely good nor entirely evil. This same truth was embodied by Lilith. To want her was to give in to the untamed nature of desire, and to fear her was to acknowledge the frailty of control. She made the heart look in the mirror and realized that fear and passion frequently come from the same well. She was called closer in whispered fantasies, but asked to keep away in whispered prayers. To keep her baby safe, a mother might sing a charm, but a lone traveler might close his eyes and visualize her hand on his cheek. She survived for centuries because of the conflict between these voices. It was impossible to break the fascination, no matter how harshly she was named or how strongly she was portrayed as dangerous. Longing gave her life, fear gave her weight, and together they wove in the endless story of her existence. Lilith herself sensed this paradox passing through the world like a second breath in the silence of the night. She was aware of the names people gave her, the ways they cursed at her while secretly dreaming about her. She had not aimed to be the shadow that haunted prayers or the terror in cradles, so sometimes the fear made her sad. She did not, however, back down from it either. Her image became ingrained in every home and firelight story because fear was power. Even under the guise of accusation, desire gave her shape, elevated her above exile, and gave her a glimmer of divinity. She floated like a spirit between these two currents, feeding off of both but not entirely belonging to either dot. She was eternal because of this ambiguity. Demons could be driven out by more powerful charms, and gods could be forgotten when their temples collapsed. But Lilith persisted because she occupied the space that neither fear nor faith could truly occupy. She wasn't just a dream or just a warning. She was the threshold itself, the spot where longing bowed into dread and fear trembled into fascination. Her shadow followed wherever hearts beat, and this threshold was inherent to human nature and not specific to any one people or place. Speaking of Lilith was therefore a reflection of the human soul. Her name became a vehicle for everything that was deep inside of her: defiance against what she couldn't accept, anxiety over what she couldn't control, and longing for what she couldn't have. Every story was unique, every picture changed, but they were all hers. Being both darkness and desire made her unbreakable, so she didn't have to choose between the two. People's own divisions betrayed them more and more the more they attempted to split her. All she needed to do was stay put, and they would fill her with their own contradictions, their own shadows, and their own desires. Thus, she traversed history as innumerable tales rather than a single one, never entirely encapsulated but never forgotten. Her presence flourished, whether in a poem composed in covert adoration or a lullaby sung to ward her off. She still hovers between desire and darkness, everlasting like the moonlight, elusive like the shadows it casts, always more than longing, always more than fear, and always both at once. Centuries later, her name, once sung against in protective lullabies and whispered in fear around firesides, started to resurface. This time in the hearts of poets who sought beauty in the shadows rather than in the mouths of terrified mothers or cautious priests. By that time, the world had changed. Libraries and temples had collapsed along with the rise and fall of empires. However, shards of her tale clung to the edges of manuscripts, to travelers' recollections, to the sporadic remnants of myth that never really vanished. She had evolved from a nighttime warning to a figure awaiting rebirth by the time the Romantic poets' ink-stained hands found her. They breathed the breath of longing, mystery, and rebellion into her name, which they discovered in ancient texts, half forgotten and covered in dust. These poets saw the ancient stories of gods and demons as more than just superstitions. They were mirrors of desire, suffering, and freedom, as well as symbols of deeper truth and the human condition. After being imprisoned in the language of fear for so long, Lilith was rediscovered as a vision, a muse, and a haunting beauty. She became the ideal symbol in a time when artists looked to the night sky and discovered poetry in storm clouds. When they preferred chaos to order, the poets recognized her bravery where the voices of the ancient world had denounced her as an exile. They discovered a lure where the past had portrayed her as dangerous, the first woman to dare say no, to choose freedom over submission, to leave even paradise rather than kneel. She was no longer the thief of cradles. Her persona softened into something both tragic and divine in these retellings. They pictured her standing under the moon, not as a monster, but as a beautiful and sorrowful woman with unbound hair and eyes full of secrets. Some described her as a seductress who enticed with forbidden charm, but even in those cases, the temptation was not malevolent. Rather, it was freedom itself, the seductive taste of living without restrictions. Others described her in gentler terms as a lone exile who was burdened by miscommunication and wandered the boundaries of creation. She was born again in each retelling, never exactly the same as before, but always retaining the spirit of her refusal to bow. This refusal was treasured by the romantic spirit. These poets and dreamers lived in a world torn between the desire for something wilder, more primordial, and the reason of enlightenment. For them, Lilith was a reminder that myth could still speak to the soul when faith no longer demanded it. A spark of rebellion that had endured for centuries. Verse that described night winds and unchained hearts was used to illustrate her story. She evolved into more than just an elderly demon. She came to represent unbridled passion and the never-ending conflict between duty and desire. Art gave her voice once more, and this time it sang. Where scripture had attempted to silence her dot, she appeared in the pages of poetry, and some readers shuddered at the thought of the more sinister tales, while others leaned in, enthralled. Once more, the Lilith paradox fear and fascination awakened, but this time it took on a more fragile form. She was more than one thing in poetry. All of these colors combined to create an image that was both human and otherworldly, whether she was in mourning, wild, tender, or dangerous. She has been likened by authors to the song of the nightingale, to the starry ocean, and to the flame that both warms and consumes. She was portrayed as something far more timeless, a reminder of the beauty and cost of freedom rather, than as a villain or saint. Artists discussed her meaning in candlelit studies and drawing rooms. Did she choose her own will over obedience, making her the eternal outsider, doomed to wander? Or was she an obscure goddess, a repressed aspect of the feminine divine that was now bursting through the gaps in tradition? Every reader recognized herself in her. Women discovered an unbroken voice in her, a person who, despite being condemned, refused to remain silent. In her, men also occasionally saw a mirror, a challenge to the strict roles they had inherited, and a representation of the wildness their souls craved but were unable to identify. Lilith also made her way into paintings as the 19th century progressed. She was depicted by artists with flowing hair, melancholy yet captivating eyes, and a twilight-draped figure. She was a vision that looked straight at the observer, asserting presence rather than an invisible shadow. Like poetry, The canvas gave her depth and restored her sense of reality. Portraits now hung in galleries to appreciate her beauty, where amulets had once been hung to ward her off. The curse was turning into a muse. Once buried in superstition, the forgotten story was now emerging in beauty, clad in the gentle rediscovery of art. However, the old tension persisted even in this revival. Some were unable to distinguish her from the more sinister murmurs, and their poetry portrayed her as the danger of unbridled desire and destructive passion. She was the chaos that overthrew order and the flame that enticed in these tales. She was welcomed as the essential shadow and the untamed companion of light, though, and was not disregarded even here. One poem called her freedom, and another called her danger. One picture yearned for her, for everyone that forewarned of her. Her power persisted because of the remaining balance. Lilith's literary comeback represented a resuscitation of possibilities, rather than merely the resuscitation of a long-forgotten myth. She was now a part of the present's longing imaginations, as well as the terrifying stories of the past. She gained form and wings from poets and artists, and as a result, she regained her timeless status. She conveyed to readers the pain of loneliness, the excitement of defiance, the hush of mystery, and the glimmer of passion. She was a myth whose heart continued to beat beneath layers of retelling, both ancient and modern. Humanity rediscovers a piece of itself in her, the beauty of the uncontrollable, the haunting pull of the unknown, and the unwavering yearning for freedom. She reappeared in the gentle rhythm of poetry, in the brushstroke of night on canvas, and in the sigh of verses whispered by candlelight. Despite having been forgotten in the rigid words of dogma, the lost story came back to life, alive, enigmatic, and timeless, but not as it had been previously told. Her story would eventually inspire poets, artists, and voices that aimed to uncover truths that had been hidden for centuries. The world changed again, and women searched myth and history for signs of their fight as they started to break free from the invisible bonds that had held them. Lilith shone like a hidden star among those half-remembered names. She was transformed into a symbol of rebellion, a person whose historical refusal persisted in the present-day desire for equality and independence. She was no longer the lonely exile under the moon or the dangerous spirit in the shadows. Women now admired her bravery where others had portrayed her as hideous. Philosophers and dreamers started to refer to her departure from Eden as an act of power, the first step toward asserting her identity, even though traditions had condemned it. Generations found their anthem in her words, "We are of the same dust." Over centuries, her refusal to bow down and her refusal to be seen as inferior reverberated like a loud bell. A declaration of equality replaced what had previously been written about disobedience. Women discovered a mythic beginning for their own struggle in Lilith's choice to leave rather than continue living in an unbalanced life. This served as a reminder that independence had always been desired, even in the earliest tales. She now belonged to those who chose freedom as a birthright, not to the periphery as a warning. Her figure, simultaneously luminous and dark, started to evoke strength rather than fear. As feminism gained traction, so did this reinterpretation. As they followed her through various cultures, scholars observed how fear had distorted her image and turned her into a demon. They discovered the mark of resistance in those very distortions. Men frequently tried to repress their fears. In a sense, being called dangerous was evidence of authority. As a result, Lilith turned into a symbol for all women who had been marginalized, silenced, or vilified for having the audacity to assert their own autonomy. One could see the reflection of innumerable real women throughout history in the stories that were told around her, those who had deviated from roles they were expected to maintain, those who had opted for independence over submission, and those who had taken the chance of being misinterpreted in order to live genuinely. This new generation of artists started to reshape her image once more. Portraits of a woman freed from chains, her eyes unwavering, her presence uncompromising, replaced the melancholy tones of exile. Poets and essayists wrote about her as someone to embrace rather than someone to avoid. She was at the forefront of the fight for equality and voice, no longer an outsider on the periphery of civilization. She was hailed by feminists as the first woman to choose freedom and to refuse to submit to authority, even at the expense of her comfort and friendship. They discovered a model of independence in her. The words that were used to describe her also changed. She was fire, strength, and defiance instead of just darkness or shadow. Her connection to the moon was changed to represent cycles, rebirth, and the ever-present resurgence of feminine strength, regardless of how frequently it is tainted. Her name was now called out in songs and chants of empowerment, whereas previously, she was prayed against. She came to represent the voiceless, the disobedient, and the wild spirit that defies restraint. Her story was re-examined in classrooms as an early narrative of resistance rather than as a holdover from superstition. It was retold that her exile from Eden was liberating. This rebirth was not without its detractors. Some people continued to hold on to the older stories, cautioning that embracing Lilith would mean accepting danger. However, this also contributed to her power. She personified the uneasiness that arises when roles are questioned and boundaries are questioned. Her narrative served as a reminder to the world that although rebellion is rarely welcomed, it is still essential. One must be prepared to be labeled defiant, even destructive, in order to assert equality. In this way, the legend of Lilith embodied both the anguish of rejection and the victory of perseverance. Her story turned into a parable about the cost of freedom and the fortitude needed to maintain it. The silent reassurance her reinterpretation provided was its calming power. She whispered across centuries to those who felt isolated in their refusal to compromise, reminding them that they were not the first to turn away. Once melancholy, her solitude by the sea evolved into a meditation on the serenity that can be found outside of forced harmony. Once tragic, her wandering under the moon has come to represent choosing one's own path under the vast sky. She taught that leaving can signify the start of something bigger rather than loss. Generations who felt her story was their own adopted this lesson. Her character frequently appeared in literature as a heroine rather than a villain. Her voice took center stage in contemporary retellings, finally allowing her to speak her truth. In addition to leaving Eden, authors envisioned her creating her own worlds and accepting the wilderness as her home. Instead of being punished, she underwent transformation in these stories, extending her independence into new spheres of spirit and creativity. The myth shifted from one of shame to one of opportunity. She was honored in art that refused to silence her, praised in songs that spoke of reclaimed power, and invoked in essays on autonomy. Over time, she evolved into more than just a historical figure. Her story was used as proof that the human desire for freedom has always been present, and her name served as a banner in campaigns for equality. Women spoke her words as affirmation. We are equal. We are unbowed. We are of the same dust. They also painted her image on walls and carried her in marches. Lilith's shadow persisted in all forms of resistance, from the silent rejection of roles to the roar of mass rebellion, not as fear, but as inspiration. In the flesh and spirit of those who claim her story, she thus resurrects herself, not just in myth. Her ancient defiance is present in every step she takes toward independence and in every voice that breaks the silence. In these tales, she is not a demon, but rather a friend and mentor who serves as a reminder to the world that the first rebellion was an act of selfhood rather than evil. She is the unwavering flame that never goes out, the whisper of strength in the night. Rebellion is not harsh in her. Rather, it is essential, life-giving, and the calm, comforting knowledge that equality means claiming what has always existed, rather than being given something new. Lilith's presence lingers in the modern world's mirror like a faint reflection interwoven with the very conflicts that mold it. Even though her story originated in the early days of myth, it still has resonance for people who struggle with issues of freedom, equality, and identity. In the 21st century, the story of a woman who once stood under the stars of Eden and proclaimed herself equal to the man standing next to her is shockingly relevant. It is a living parable of resistance that asks each listener, how will you claim your own place in the world? It is not just an old myth whispered in the dark. Her refusal to bow is now more than just a historical tale. It is a mirror that allows you to see and comprehend the difficulties of the present. Debates about what it means to live equally continue to rage across nations. The modern equivalents of the ancient conflict between Lilith's defiance and Adam's expectations are the rights to be heard, to walk freely without fear, and to make decisions about one's own body and destiny. As she once emphasized, we are of the same dust. Innumerable voices today assert that equality is a reality rather than a gift. Lilith's tale serves as a reminder that, even at the expense of comfort or a sense of belonging, freedom must occasionally be asserted. Because harmony based on inequality isn't harmony at all, she left Eden's harmony. The same lesson applies to contemporary societies, where peace cannot be maintained if it is based on silence and submission, and where advancement frequently necessitates upending the status quo. The myth of Lilith also resonates strongly with personal freedom. The picture of her walking by herself out of Eden, led by the moon and the winds, represents the bravery to leave behind what is comfortable in order to stay true to oneself. This still resonates in the lives of countless people today, those who reject traditions that do not suit them, those who do not fit into predetermined roles, and those who prefer to be alone rather than compromise their identity. It is never an easy journey. Loneliness frequently ensues, much like Adam's grief grew more intense after Lilith left. However, her decision still has timeless appeal. Solitude need not be a sign of emptiness. Rather, it can be the source of freedom. The lesson is that integrity sometimes necessitates a breakaway, not that exile is preferable. Her myth gives courage to those who want to go their own way in a world where expectations still weigh heavily on people. Lilith's defiance speaks to anyone whose freedom has been questioned or who has been told to live in submission to an authority figure they never chose, so her significance goes beyond women. She is the patroness of people who defy expectations, conventions, or systems. For instance, Lilith has been viewed by the LGBTQ+ community as a kindred spirit who deviated from the limited script that was written for her. She is portrayed as a symbol of autonomy, proving that one's identity is derived from one's own truth rather than being determined by others. Her myth transforms from a gendered story into a larger tale of human dignity and serves as a reminder that everyone who has the courage to pursue freedom is entitled to it. However, the costs of defiance are also reflected in her mirror. We are reminded that rebellion has repercussions by Lilith's exile, her loneliness, and her metamorphosis into a mythical and shadowy figure. Walking away from roles that have been imposed means walking into uncertainty. Those who choose freedom still frequently encounter misinterpretation, condemnation, or exclusion. Every time society labels the independent as self-centered, the outspoken as dangerous, or the non-conforming as abnormal, the whispers that portrayed Lilith as dangerous continue to reverberate in more subdued forms. Therefore, her myth serves as both a source of inspiration and a means of preparation, teaching that loneliness is frequently the cost of freedom, and that having the guts to stand up for what is right may come with the burden of rejection or fear. However, her story is one of change rather than hopelessness. Lilith's transformation from demon to symbol, from curse to banner of strength, demonstrates how stories can shift and how what was once suppressed can be reclaimed. The strength of reinterpretation is another lesson for contemporary struggles. Once constricting words, names, and talis can be transformed into tools of emancipation. She is now invoked as a voice of power, whereas previously she was a nightmare whispered to silence women. The very instruments of oppression can be reclaimed by contemporary movements and transformed into emblems of pride and tenacity. In this way, Lilith represents both rebellion and reinvention, the skill of redefining oneself from historical shards and transforming weakness into strength. The quiet tenacity of her truth that equality is not attained in a single act of defiance, but rather in the continuous fight to uphold it, is also reflected in the mirror of today. Lilith's journey out of Eden was a start, not a finish. Her footsteps reverberate into every generation that must choose between stepping into the uncertainty of freedom or continuing in unequal harmony. According to her myth, equality is a path pursued in defiance and self-belief rather than a destination bestowed by others. Those who must face the night of their own decisions are still reminded by the winds that whispered strength to her that freedom is worth the risk and that courage is achievable. Lilith's persona is both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. As societies continue to struggle with inequality in the workplace, in homes, in laws, and in culture, ignoring imbalance leads to silent rifts that deepen into exile, she cautions. She motivates by demonstrating how the simple act of speaking up, leaving, or refusing to give in can alter the path of history. The very reason her myth has persisted is that it is incomplete. It is repeated with every new fight for liberty, and altered by every new generation that tries to comprehend its own course. Her influence can be seen today in the quiet tenacity of daily existence as well as in scholarly reinterpretations and feminist discourse. Lilith's defiance is reflected in a woman choosing to follow her dreams in spite of criticism, a man rejecting suffocating roles, and a young person embracing an identity that others attempt to suppress. She lives by refusing requests for submission, eschewing things that make her feel less and asserting her birthright to equality. Her lesson is intimate rather than remote, and it is reflected in the little decisions that people make today that determine their level of freedom. Lilith sees herself in the mirror today as a friend in the quest for selfhood rather than as a terrifying figure. Her story serves as a reminder that rebellion is not destruction but rather the establishment of a truth-based existence. Like the night winds that once led her away from Eden, her defiance is steady and calm rather than harsh. She teaches that having the quiet guts to declare, "I am equal, I am free, I will not bow," is what truly defines freedom rather than dominance or submission. And her ancient voice still whispers, timeless and unbroken, as the world struggles with issues of equality and personal freedom. The tale of Lilith, muttered since the beginning of time, is no longer restricted to the land of Eden or the desolate beaches where she once set foot. Despite their mortal beginnings, her footsteps propelled her into something bigger and more timeless than her own life. What started as one woman's decision to not bend or kneel became such a massive echo that it changed generations' perceptions of themselves. During this metamorphosis, Lilith evolved from a physical person to an idea and a presence that existed outside of time. Through centuries of whispers, fears, songs, and retellings, her journey from human to myth was gradual rather than abrupt, ultimately leading to her name becoming immortal. Her escape from Eden and her lonely wanderings are not the climax of her forgotten story. Rather, it is her survival through storytelling and her refusal to disappear even after being erased. Her decision to leave rather than give up was a seed sown in people's minds. It was Lilith who stepped into the unknown, and she would live on in memory, even though Adam stayed in Eden, protected by the harmony of obedience. Her defiance is at the heart of the myths that surround her, which are molded by fascination, fear, and reinterpretation. That defiance turned out to be too strong to be lost and too remarkable to be quieted. She became more radiant while others vanished into the shadows of myth and scripture, the very darkness surrounding her, molding her into an unmissable presence. This is where her story reaches its climax, not in a single act of rebellion, but in the centuries-long ripple that act produced. She had many names in the ancient world, and her memory was layered with numerous faces. She was associated with storm spirits, night creatures that hovered close to houses and attempted to disturb what was protected there in Mesopotamia. Her reputation grew even more bleak in Hebrew tradition, as she was a target of charms and prayers meant to keep mothers and children safe. She was shaped differently by each culture, but none was able to totally eradicate her. Her strength lay in the paradox of her myth, which was both remembered and feared. To be feared is to be recognized, and Lilith flourished in recognition. She was never forgotten, despite being portrayed as dangerous. And it was in that perseverance that her metamorphosis began. Her silent witness was the full moon rising over seas and deserts. Her breath, her alert eyes, and her restless presence seemed to be carried by the shadows that grew longer in the night. Her name remained, never banished, when mothers whispered songs of protection. Poets looked to her as a symbol of passion and rebellion. Her story was repeated when dreamers envisioned the person who straddled the line between desire and darkness. This endless adaptability is what ultimately marks Lilith's transformation into legend. She is not just a part of the ancient, one culture or one story, but of everyone who struggles with freedom, fear, and the desire for a truth greater than themselves. This paradox that she was intended to serve as a warning, but ended up inspiring others, is what gives her climax its dramatic beauty. The tale, which was originally used to scare daughters into obedience, became a source of inspiration for those who aspired to independence. The same name that had been muttered in terror was now muttered in awe. Lilith changed history by choosing to walk away rather than lead armies or rule from a throne. Because it was unforgettable, that seemingly small choice turned into a vast one. Eden stayed the same, perfect but silent, but Lilith's departure gave rise to an endless tale. Her memory, not her body, is what gives her immortality. By naming her, the world was compelled to keep her alive even as it attempted to demonize her. She evolved into a spirit of resistance, the part of the human heart that is unflinching even in the face of danger, and a spirit of the night. Lilith's story thus reached its climax in transformation rather than defeat. She was no longer just the woman of Eden. She was now the timeless representation of freedom and defiance that was ingrained in humankind's collective psyche. The subtle power of stories themselves is also revealed by this metamorphosis. A story can endure for millennia, rewritten and retold until it no longer belongs to one time or people, but to everyone. A human life may fade, even though Lilith's story was lost to official records. It persisted in lullabies and amulets, in poetry and rebellion, and in whispers and songs. She lived in the shadows of history, but she came out of them as timeless. Thus, the culmination of her lost story is not just about her, but also about the ability of storytelling to grant immortality. She serves as a reminder that once something is chosen and spoken, it cannot be completely undone. She is still present today, but not as a terrifying figure, but rather as a mirror. Mystics have referred to her as a protector of secrets, artists as a muse of rebellion, and feminists as a symbol of equality. Although her form changes in each retelling, her essence stays the same. She is the one who refused to bow. Her status as a legend is cemented by her consistency in the face of change. She is both human and eternal, old and new. This smooth transition between the past and present, in which her myth speaks as clearly today as it did thousands of years ago, is the culmination of her story. The knowledge that her defiance was not in vain provides the calming aspect of her climax. Even though she left by herself and faced suspicion and loneliness, her decision was not ignored. It developed into something bigger than her own life. Her name was also carried by the winds that once carried her out of Eden, dispersing it throughout generations and cultures until it became a part of the world. Her story became a myth, and myth became memory eternal. Lilith transformed not only herself but the imagination of humanity, and in doing so, she reshaped history. Ultimately, Lilith's forgotten story's climax is a beginning that never ends rather than a conclusion. She is evidence that even those who are exiled can become immortal, and that decision-making itself can endure beyond death. She is no longer just the muse of poets and rebels, the first woman of Eden, or the night spirit that mothers dread. She embodies each of these qualities and more. She reminds us that once freedom is claimed, it cannot be taken away. She is a legend and an enduring presence. The culmination of her story is its continuation, the point at which human choice gives rise to myth, where one woman's refusal becomes the timeless emblem of resistance, whispered from generation to generation, carried in the shadows and illuminated by the moon dot when viewed as a reflection of the human spirit rather than just a story of fear or rebellion. Lilith's story emerges as a silent manual for people looking for purpose in their own hardships. The shadows that trailed behind her were never just dark. They were also places of introspection, places where people could examine themselves without being blinded by the perfection of perfection. Soft and steady lessons emerge from those shadows, reminding us that freedom comes with a price. Faith is not unquestioned, and struggle has a reason. Her myth contains unavoidable truths, whether it is presented as a caution or as awe. She demonstrates how even things that are rejected, forgotten, or feared can harbor a seed of wisdom. Her first lesson is freedom. Her decision to leave Eden was motivated by her unwavering realization that she could not live in chains rather than by malice. She serves as a reminder that real freedom must be chosen, frequently at a high cost. Few people would dare to leave comfort behind and venture into the wilderness, leaving behind company in favor of solitude. Lilith, nevertheless, demonstrates that the soul longs for genuineness over security. In addition to courage, freedom necessitates trust that the road ahead, despite its loneliness and uncertainty, contains more truth than the solace of compliance. She teaches us that freedom is the capacity to face hardship with one's own will, intact, not the absence of it. The next lesson is faith. Her story is one of belief in something more profound than imposed rules, not of incredulity. Lilith had faith in her own voice and the self-respect she possessed. She exemplified the paradox of faith by leaving, putting more faith in the unknown than in the well-known garden, and believing in the invisible. For many, faith is shaped by conformity and fear of punishment, but her myth suggests another layer, that faith can be the courage to listen inwardly to the quiet whisper of the soul. Lilith teaches that faith is trust in the truth that calls us, even when it takes us into the shadows and wilderness rather than mindless obedience. Her story serves as a reminder that spiritual journeys can occasionally involve moving outside of walls rather than staying inside them. Perhaps the most profound lesson is that of struggle. Those who were unable to accept Lilith's decision turned her image into something monstrous and linked her name to fear. Despite being misunderstood, vilified, and alone, she persisted. She demonstrates that struggle is a sign of movement and change rather than of failure. The conflict-filled stories that surround her serve as a reminder that each soul must contend with its own shadows. She fought not just against Adam or divine decree, but also against the expectations of others about her. Even though it was painful, that struggle is what gave her eternal life. She teaches us that when the spirit is grounded in truth, struggle does not break it. Rather, it refines and unveils the depths of what cannot be silenced. Her myth's shadows conceal truths beneath terror. Mothers who sang prayers to protect against her, poets who romanticized her, and cultures that whispered about her were all reacting to something inside of them as well as a figure of night. Myths endure because they serve as windows into the human condition. The reason Lilith's myth endures is because it captures the conflict between light and shadow, obedience and freedom, and desire and fear. She is more than just a heroine or a demon because humans possess both. She demonstrates the complexity of the human heart, how we yearn for truth but are afraid of the price of seeking it, and how we are drawn to freedom but shudder at the loneliness. it may bring. Her myth also teaches us about the power of narrative in general. Myths endure because they convey truths that the soul can identify with. They don't just happen to be around. Because Lilith's story whispered of freedom, individuality, and the refusal to bow beneath its cautions and anxieties, it endured. Her presence was recognized even in the prayers that were directed against her. Her name persisted even in the amulets and charms. The truth she carried in her shadow was too powerful to disappear. The deepest human concerns, the need for safety, the fear of the unknown, the yearning for freedom, and the harmony of light and dark are what give myths their hidden truths. Lilith's myth serves as a constant reminder that sometimes the things we fear are also the things we need to know the most. Her teachings are applicable to the present day and go beyond myths from antiquity. Every soul experiences times when silence feels safer than speaking and obedience feels easier than the truth. Lilith teaches that being true to oneself is a decision of becoming rather than of destruction, even though it may result in loneliness. In her narrative, freedom was not bestowed by Eden, but rather was asserted by eschewing it. Modern battles for equality, genuineness, and individual dignity are echoed by that deed. Her shadow serves as a reminder that, even when others don't understand, we too must occasionally venture into uncharted territory. While listening to our inner guidance, she also demonstrates the importance of balance. Chaos can result from embracing freedom without wisdom, and hopelessness can result from embracing obedience without freedom. Instead of pushing for one extreme, Lilith's story highlights the conflict between holding on to both light and shadow. Humanity is not one-dimensional, as her myth teaches. We are creatures of courage and fear, light and shadow, desire and restraint. Honoring the entirety of who we are is a way to uphold the lesson she taught us over the years, that no aspect of the human soul should be suppressed, because doing so leads to distortion. Lilith's shadow may teach us the most consoling lesson. Of all, what is cast out is not lost. We still have the aspects of ourselves that we are afraid of, the secrets we conceal, and the decisions we regret. Like Lilith, they linger, awaiting recognition and integration into our entire identity. Her story demonstrates how even the forgotten can influence history and how the rejected can become immortal. When confronted with the truth, the shadows of our own lives can become sources of strength instead of fear. Lilith's myth ultimately asks you as to listen rather than to follow her. She is a guide who whispers from the edges, from places we might otherwise overlook, rather than standing in the spotlight. She challenges us to bravely embrace freedom, to have faith even in the face of uncertainty, and to view adversity as a learning opportunity rather than a punishment. She asks us to consider who we are and who we might become by demonstrating that myths are never just tales of the past, but also voices bringing truths into the present. Her shadows teach us guidance rather than hopelessness. They serve as a reminder that, despite its loneliness, the road of authenticity is never empty. Freedom is still whispered by the winds that once carried her away from Eden. She cannot be erased, as evidenced by the prayers that were once said against her. The myth itself, changed and timeless, gives us hope that the truths we need might be hidden in the shadows we fear. And we can take solace in Lilith's shadow because we know that even when we are rejected or alone, we have purpose and light that are just waiting to be found in the shadows. A story that has wandered through centuries of voices, interpretations, and fears eventually settles into a quietness that comes with prolonged telling. Once spoken in tremors or written in curses, Lilith's name now floats through time like a dying echo. What is left is something softer, an emotional stillness that resembles peace instead of the severity of judgment or the burden of fear. Her story, intricate and expansive, molded by both light and shadow, ends with the peaceful solace of introspection rather than with thunder or fire. As if Lilith and those who have carried her story could finally breathe. That acceptance lies here, in the gentle twilight of her legend. When viewed through the calm distance of time, the storms of conflict, rebellion, and misunderstanding all appear to soften. Her decision to leave Eden initially stung like a wound, a break too severe for human hearts to readily accept. However, her figure changed over the ages as different cultures recounted her stories in their own languages and anxieties. She was demonized, reclaimed, feared, and loved. She has, however, transformed into something else in the lengthy rhythm of myth's breathing, a reminder of the courage required to just be. That reminder now glows steadily and warmly like embers rather than with fire. The solace of contemplation is found in holding on to the past with love, realizing that all stories change as people's hearts do. Now, Lilith is more than just the ferocious outlaw or the dreadful night spirit. She is a complex character whose journey reflects humanity's own. Her loneliness, her exile, and her perseverance in the face of centuries of condemnation no longer call for indignation or fear, but rather empathy. In the silence of introspection, she transforms from the night's curse into the voice of perseverance and a resilient figure tempered by the passage of time. Finally, rest finds a place in her story. There is now space to view her in a different light, whereas previously her name was tied to prayers of protection and her footsteps were cast into the wilderness. Rest enables them to be viewed with gentleness, but it does not remove her struggle or the fears that were once associated with her name. Her presence is now carried by the night, which once seemed to be full of her threat. Like a lullaby, as gentle as the wind that blows through trees during a full moon. Once burdened by grief, her solitude turns into a sort of peaceful haven, a place where the soul can rest, away from the cacophony of condemnation. In that quiet place, acceptance starts to blossom. Acceptance of the fact that no story can ever truly depict the entirety of a person, and that Lilith was never just what other people thought of her. Acceptance of the fact that fascination and fear can coexist without destroying one another. Acceptance that underlying layers of superstition can conceal guiding truths and sparks of light within even the darkest myths. The knowledge that fear frequently conceals misunderstanding is consoling to those who once feared her. Knowing that her strength endures even after being tempered by tenderness brings solace to those who once exalted her. Peace emerges when acceptance creates space for every aspect of her story, including the loneliness and the strength, the anguish and the freedom. Not only does Lilith's peace rest here, but so does the peace of those who told her story. She stands for freedom versus obedience, individuality versus conformity, and shadow versus light, all of which humanity has long struggled with. In reflection, writing down her story also means writing down some of those conflicts, to take a break from their intensity, not to completely resolve them. Reflection provides a break from the challenges of interpretation, much like the night does after a long day. Her name can now be gently recalled as a piece of the vast tapestry of myth, without needing to be protected from harm or hoisted as a banner dot. It is not a sign of forgetting to accept her story fading into silence. Instead, it is the type of quiet that contains memories, such as the silence that occurs in between a song's verses. Lilith remains in that silence as a familiar and serene presence rather than as a danger or a saint. Whispers of her perseverance are now carried by the winds that once carried her cries. Once appearing to watch her in grief, the stars now acknowledge her quietly. Her story is now buried in the soil of the same earth that once held her loneliness, enabling it to take root deeper than fear. Seeing her through balance rather than extremes has a healing effect. The harmony of light and dark, of tenderness and strength, of exile and acceptance. Lilith's tale no longer needs to be vehement in order to be heard, nor does it need to be frightening in order to be remembered. Now it just lies down, like water, settling into a still pond. A woman human in her defiance, human in her solitude, and human in her endurance is depicted in the reflection upon that water, not a monster or a saint. Seeing her as neither more nor less than that humanity is, what will heal her? The solace of introspection provides some of their own healing for those who reminisce about her myth. They recognize aspects of themselves in her that they previously feared or denied. They observe that her exile softens their own loneliness. They see their own bravery in her defiance, which is no longer frightening but rather motivating. They can see in her shadows that the aspects of herself that are hidden are truths that are just waiting to be accepted, not curses. In this context, her myth transforms from an external narrative into a mirror where people can see reflections of their own experiences. Finally, the story becomes quiet. The voices of centuries, poets singing, mothers praying, rebels reclaiming, priests warning slow to silence. Although Lilith is still there, it is not restrained by conflict. Like night itself, it is a presence that envelops the world in its gentle blanket without being harsh or menacing. Where there was once fear, there is now rest. Once resonating. In curses, the name now floats in serene remembrance. And after being told so many times, the story eventually fades into obscurity. Like the silence that follows a heavy sigh, this silence is full and not empty. It gently rests the burden of everything that has been said, feared, and loved. It's a quiet that accepts and heals. Lilith is not gone, but at peace in this silence. Her story is complete not in victory or defeat, but in the consolation of being. Remembered, understood, and at last given the opportunity to rest. Therefore, the solace of introspection is not just for her, but for everyone who has shared her story. It is the understanding that, like people, myths do not have to be stuck in a state of perpetual conflict. They can also become softer. They are also capable of healing. They, too, have the ability to fade into silence without disappearing, leaving behind wisdom instead of wounds and peace instead of curses. Lilith's story thus ends softly, like night falling over the world or the last note of a song lingering in the air before vanishing into silence. Not as flame or fear, but as peace itself. She is present in the silence. Her name floats through the ages like a faint sigh, carried on winds that touch forests, oceans, and deserts alike. Her story has never really vanished. Instead, it lingers as a whisper, so faint that it could almost be mistaken for the silence of the night. Lilith's story is not one of straight lines, but rather one of meandering paths. where thunder is followed by silence and shadows bend into light. Each stage of her story has its own breath, pause, and secret resting place, and to remember her journey is to follow those whispers back in time. And these echoes softly fade away as the mind approaches sleep, leading the listener into a serene space where myth and memory blend into the cadence of dreams. It all started with the first garden, which was a picture-perfect setting but also tense. Lilith went there with the intention of standing on an equal footing rather than being satisfied to bow. That decision rippled like water disturbed by a single stone, and she loved the garden, but she loved her freedom even more. A faint echo of her defiant words, once uttered in rage, lingers in the air. She refused to kneel, and she refused to yield. The remainder of her story was molded by that decision, that silent rejection. Her name still carries that same note of independence, woven into the night's fabric, even when spoken softly. She left and was embraced by the wilderness. She was alone by the shores, listening to the sound of the wind and the crash of the waves. Tears came then, not bitter but purifying, as if the sea's salt carried her strength forward and washed away her grief. Her memories of those evenings by the water are as gentle as the sound of the tides, and her isolation turned into both a haven and a form of exile. Hearing the story now is like listening to the soft lap of waves, a reminder that there can be peace even in solitude and the quiet solace of being oneself in grief. Slowly, like dawn peeking over a dark horizon, freedom arrived. Her name was whispered by the winds that swept through the wilderness, whispering strength she had never known before. She discovered what it meant to belong to herself in those whispers, to just be, not to command or be commanded. Like the shifting air that moves unseen but transforms everything it touches, this freedom was gentle and soft rather than harsh or noisy. This same softness, a liberation that feels less like rebellion and more like the sigh of someone finally breathing in their own rhythm, is present when her story is told today. Others, however, recounted her story in a different way. Unaware people muttered her name in terror, referring to her as the Night Woman and incorporating cautions into their lullabies. Their voices were hushed, as if speaking too loudly might call Lilith, and her presence was depicted in their stories as shadows. Nevertheless, fascination held onto her name despite the fear. Her image became more than human, half flame, half shadow, until she was as much a part of memory as legend. Whether in awe or fear, she became immortal and untouchable in those whispers. In their imaginations, she became the spirit of night. They claimed that mothers prayed to the night to keep her away, that owls called her name, and that shadows huddled around her body. Low chants, gentle lullabies, and string-tied amulets became songs of protection as a result of these prayers being recited in unison for generations. Even as they tried to keep her away, they kept her alive in memory, so each note was both a whisper against her and a strange acknowledgement. Their murmurs were woven into the nighttime fabric, and even now, as the world becomes quiet, it seems as though those songs are still audible, resonating through the shadows. Her image spread over centuries and lands, mingling with older echoes from Mesopotamia, where other air and night spirits were once named with awe and fear. Myths merged into one another over time, and her form changed like a dusk shadow. She was not entirely confined by any one culture. but each one contributed to her existence, transforming her into a multifaceted figure that was passed down through the ages in bits and pieces. In this way, she murmured between passages of scripture, poetry, and folklore, existing not only as fear but also as memory. On some nights, Lilith seemed to own the moon herself. Its light caused shadows to stretch as though they were dancing to her quiet movements. According to some, the full moon summoned her forth, shrouding her in shadow and silver, making her simultaneously invisible and radiant. Her name sounded like a lullaby in the vast, watchful night sky, and those who looked up wondered if she hung there, tethered between the darkness and the light. Her story blended with the moon in whispers fainter than breath, and her presence was like the tides, pull unseen, unstoppable, and eternal. Her paradox lived between desire and darkness. They both feared and yearned for her. They cursed it and admired her. She embodied the very paradoxes of human nature. We are drawn to what we fear and afraid of what we desire. This duality turned into one of her most persistent whispers because, in her, people saw not just the night but also themselves, their unspoken strengths, their forbidden thoughts, and their hidden desires. And despite their best efforts to cast her into the background, they were unable to stop their voices from repeatedly whispering her name. Fascination mixed with fear. Her name, which had previously been whispered in warning tones, came back to life centuries later. She started to be written about by poets in softer tones, not as a curse but as a query. In search of mystery and defiance, romantic minds drew her out of her silence and gave her voice again. Her whispers gradually changed from ones of fear to ones of inspiration, and her story, which had been hidden, began to appear in poetry, art, and literature. Those who saw in her depth rather than destruction resurrected her myth as a muse rather than a terrifying figure. The whispers changed once more as time moved into the present. Lilith evolved from a legendary character to a representation of defiance, equality, and self-reliance. Her refusal to kneel was now portrayed as bravery rather than just defiance. Her story was long hidden under curses, but feminist voices brought it to light and whispered her name as a hymn of strength. In addition to being a woman of shadows, she turned into a guide for people discovering their own voices and a mirror for those pursuing freedom. Instead of bringing fear into the waking world, her whispers brought empowerment. Her influence can still be seen in contemporary struggles. People see in her the echo of defiance, the insistence that no soul should be diminished and that no voice should be silenced. Her story teaches us about bravery, independence, and complexity. And those lessons find their way into hearts that are still struggling with the same issues she once encountered. Questions of equality, belonging, faith, and choice through the soft murmurs of her story. Her myth whispers these lessons like a gentle reminder at the edge of sleep that freedom, no matter how expensive, is always worth the journey it blazes. As a result, her journey becomes quiet. Lilith's story has returned to silence after moving from the garden to the wilderness, from fascination to fear, and from shadow to symbol. It is the silence of peace, introspection, and tender remembrance, not the silence of forgetting. Though they are no longer curses or warnings, her whispers continue to reverberate through the night. They are slow, gentle lullabies that lead listeners to relaxation rather than fear. Her name now evokes a sense of calm rather than condemnation, a presence that both stirs and calms. Her story fades away like a faraway breeze as sleep approaches, leaving only the solace that even the most misinterpreted tales can find serenity. Lilith only remains as a whisper, a gentle voice that endures through the ages, reminding the audience that tales, like dreams, don't have to end in terror. They can conclude with serenity, introspection, and the soft embrace of the night itself. Like a last whisper or sigh, her name lingers there, gently lulling the listener to sleep. Slowly, the silence falls, enveloping the world like a gentle blanket, with each fold erasing the day's edges. Even the most restless parts of the mind start to quiet down as the night drifts, settles, and lingers in gentle layers. A blessing that appears to breathe itself into the atmosphere is contained within this silence. It is a benediction expressed, not through words, but through the silence itself. This is how the night whispers to you, "May the silent night envelop you." And there is only the slow rhythm of calm that pulls one closer and closer to rest in that embrace. Nothing heavy or harsh. The moon gently rises, a pale lantern in the sky that is glowing but not blazing, providing just enough light to direct the gaze away from distraction and toward comfort. As if painting the earth in dreams, its silver touch glides over branches, rooftops, and fields. In response, shadows sway softly, stretching in rhythm rather than menace, as if the silence of the night had also soothed them. Every shift in light and shadow becomes like a gentle lullaby etched on the scenery, guiding the heart toward tranquility. The air itself seems to hum with it, a gentle vibration that releases tension from the body if you listen carefully. Every nighttime sound blends together, not in disarray but in unison. The soft sigh of the wind, the distant owl's cry, and the silent rustle of leaves all build up to a cohesive whole. Together, they create a rhythm as steady as breathing, even though none of them is louder than a whisper. It is the sound of life taking a break and the world getting ready to dream. Your own breathing also becomes a part of this rhythm, rising and falling like waves against the coast, finding an innate cadence that seems limitless and timeless. The feeling that everything is in its proper place, resting, and wholeness also grows as this rhythm does. Such silence conceals a blessing that feels present even when it is not expressed out loud. The night itself seems to be leaning in and embracing those who are prepared to let go of their burdens. Concerns that were painful during the day become faint whispers that can no longer be held so firmly. Once hurried thoughts start to slow down, as if they have been lulled into a rhythm that no longer requires urgency. The night gently holds them and relieves their burden, providing a reassuring silence that reassures them that they are safe, supported, and sufficient. Sleep comes like a tide, drawing nearer with each breath and quiet moment rather than a sudden plunge. Each muscle relaxes as if night had rubbed its hands over every tense thread, allowing the body to sink further into its resting position. Even the hands and feet loosen their hold on the day, and the shoulders become softer and the chest less rigid. The blessing of the night is felt more profoundly in this peaceful unbinding. May the silent night envelop you. The words remain in the air like the faintest of echoes, carried into the soul by the breeze, even though they are not spoken, with each tiny spark serving as a reminder that even in vastness, there is presence and light. The stars above seem less like far-off fires and more like glimmers of comfort. They merely shine, steady and serene, as though to whisper that you, too, are a part of this peaceful eternity. They don't demand attention. It feels small but comforting to lie beneath them in thought as if being small is a relief rather than a burden. You can rest in their still glow, knowing that the night will watch over you while you close your eyes. Though not yet here, dreams are waiting at the edges and are getting closer with each breath out. When the mind is soft enough to allow them in, they wait patiently and kindly, without pushing or pulling, ready to unfold. They are soft and formless, like clouds waiting at the horizon, only to take shape when the heart is prepared to accompany them on their journey. And when they do arrive, they will not be startling. Rather, they will carry the sleeper through soft landscapes, memories, and visions that are stitched together with threads of shadow and moonlight. The night speaks once more, but this time, it does so through feeling rather than words. The air feels cool against the skin like a feather, the resting places get calming warmth, and the outside world becomes quieter and quieter until the only sound left is the sound of breathing. This is the beat that gradually descends farther into the soft night. The body gradually forgets the day as each breath brings calm and each exhale releases weight. Like a prayer that requires no words, like a lullaby sung without voice, the blessing grows stronger. It is a gift to everyone who chooses to listen, resting in the air with kindness and steadiness. Even the mind, which frequently echoes and asks questions, starts to quiet down. Thoughts may still flutter like tiny sparks, but they do not hold on. Instead, they disperse into the vast void of darkness one by one like fireflies. And where they are gone, there is a silence that is so profound that it seems as though the world has leaned in to provide solace. It is not empty. Rather, it is full of the peaceful presence and the gentle hum of life. The promise that you are not alone is contained in that fullness. Like everything else, you are equally and endlessly held by the silent night. The night's embrace gets softer, warmer, and closer. The air itself seems to have taken on the texture of a blanket, enveloping you in layers until you are no longer distinct but rather a part of the silence. The distinction between waking and dreaming becomes increasingly blurred, breathing slows. The body gets heavier and the spirit gets lighter. The blessing remains constant, pulsing with each breath. May the peaceful night envelop you. Again and again, until the soft hum of your own heart is all that is left, rocking you to sleep instead of an external voice, and as you go farther, the outside world disappears into the quiet of the night's melody. The last remnants of conscious thought vanish like mist. The moon turns into a soft glow behind closed eyes, and the stars gradually fade. All that's left is tranquility, silence, and the gentle rhythm of sleep embracing you wholeheartedly. Resting safe and carried into dreams, you are held in the calm of the night after the blessing has completed its task. Together we have been carried by the night through whispers and shadows, through tales of quiet introspection, fascination, fear, and freedom. Every word has been a step closer to serenity, and every silence has been a breath of relief from the day's stress. The story itself seems to want to rest with you as we approach this last moment. There is no hurry or abrupt conclusion, just a slowing. We arrived here thanks to the echoes of Lilith's journey, which now subside into a gentle silence that brings you calm and tranquility. And I want to talk to you as if we were sitting in silence together, just the two of us, saying this kind farewell before we let go of this night's journey. I encourage you to let me know if this story has brought you comfort or if these moments have made you feel at ease. To help this journey reach more dreamers and rest-seeking wanderers, please leave a like. Post your thoughts in the comments section, adding your voice to the chorus of people who have followed Lilith's story, not as noise, but as whispers. Tell me how her story affected you, where it led you, and what unspoken truths it left you with. Each comment carries its own light and becomes another thread in this tapestry of voices. Additionally, by subscribing, you can ensure that the door is always open and the lantern is always lit, ready to lead you back if you ever want to revisit and explore these paths. The night has more stories to tell than this one. Beyond this one story, there are more adventures awaiting you, softer routes to relaxation. A story about ancient myths, a gentle retelling of lost folklore, or even a brand new dream created especially for evenings like these could captivate you. They are waiting for you if you want to continue walking-related videos that gently call, each one a lullaby of its own, each one a companion to help you move closer to serenity. They will wait for you, so you don't need to make a decision right now. They will be there when it feels right, like stars that are just waiting for you to look up. But for the time being, there is nothing left to hold on to or pursue, nothing but silence, rest only. Here, in the peaceful embrace of night, you are safe, blessed with the soft, effortless, and undemanded arrival of sleep. Let go of the day's burden. Allow your worries to untie themselves like knots and slip silently into the darkness where they can no longer bother you. Breathe slowly. Allow each breath to carry you deeper, and know that the serenity this story has provided will remain with you even as it fades. I appreciate you being here, listening, and sharing this silence with me. Giving yourself time to be quiet and allowing a story to be your companion in the dark is a simple yet lovely thing. So, without making a big statement, I would like to express my gratitude in a whisper that is only for you. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for walking this journey. Let your eyes soften now if they haven't already. Allow your breathing to settle into a rhythm if it hasn't already. Imagine the night enveloping you like a blanket, warm and light, tailored just for you, neither oppressive nor heavy. The world's silence is your lullaby, the moon is your lamp, and the stars are your companions. You don't need anything else, and you don't need to do anything else. The silence is yours to maintain now that the story has been told. Let's gently close this moment as it draws to a close. I hope you find solace in the darkness. I hope you have pleasant dreams. May you be completely restored by the rest you find. And may you always know that these whispers, these stories, will be there for you when you need them. You're always welcome to come back. Other stories await you if you want to explore further. And let that be sufficient if all you want to do is sleep. I'll leave you here for the time being, where there is only the sound of your breath and the coziness of the night. Rest well, dream gently, and take this tranquility with you into the next day. I appreciate you being here, listening, and taking a break. My friend, good night.